Well, ladies and gentlemen, I have the complete delight and thrill to speak with Benjamin Studebaker, who was at the house, and we had so much fun. And the hours flew by. It was a complete joy. Theory Underground was here, Dave and Nance and every Will and Ann, and we had the Agaraja. Forever the garage will be the Agaraja. I'm going to put a plaque up. It's going to be great. And we had so much fun. And also we had a discussion on democracy that was great. I've just really enjoyed it. And I really enjoyed the recent presentation he gave at Platypus. He had a wonderful conversation with Catrone and Doug Lane recently. But Mr. Studebaker is very often having engaging and enlightening discussions and presentations, so you cannot go wrong. Just pick something you'll learn. Yeah, it's really important and incredible and elegant work. And I always am very engaged by what you put forth. Also, both of your books are very important. The Way is Shut, your work on legitimacy, I think they're at the edge of the conversation that if you're not having, I think you're not having the conversation that needs to be had. And one wants to be in that space, and Mr. Studebaker enables people to be in that space for the conversation that needs to be had. So, Mr. Studebaker, thank you for being here, and I'm just going to ask you what you're thinking about and what's alive, because that's fun. So thank you for your time today, Benjamin. It's really a treat.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be in your space. Your space will generate the conversation that we're about to have. And I think it's going to be a good one.
Yes,
Of
sir.
course, I've been thinking, like so many people, about the tariffs, the crazy tariffs that have everybody going nuts because people haven't thought enough about trade in recent years. They haven't thought enough about how the economy works in recent years. So if something happens, they're confused and they don't know what to make of it. And then a lot of people throw out various opinions that are motivated by what they'd like to be true or what would fit with their preferences in terms of how they wish the world worked, in part because it's very difficult for people who don't have expertise or haven't spent much time reading in this area to quickly catch up.
No, I think it is a fascinating topic, and it is interesting to me. I think that point of something suddenly changes and everyone's trying to catch up. There's a certain frantic sort of scrounging around, a certain terror that is going on. And then, of course, people tend to assume if it's good or bad for the economy based on Wall Street. And if Wall Street is tanking, then surely it is a disaster in different things. I think also it's kind of like we talked about. In the garage, I like to talk in sociology about tragedy, trade-offs, all of these different things. And really, things like tariffs, you're often talking about trade-offs. You're talking about very benefits here and there. And the questions are they the trade-offs we want to make? And for me, the reaction to the tariffs has also shown, again, my bias of interpretation is that we really aren't able to think trade-offs, nor are we even able to have a discussion of trade-offs. And to see, well, what do we want, right? What is actually going to be good? Just put things very generally. One way I think often about the tensions of capitalism, and of course that's a loaded phrase, but if you grant it for me, generally I like to think about three categories. So wealth, which you can associate with technology, quality of life, maybe institutions, infrastructure, and so on. And that's a lot of things to put under one category, I understand. But generally, wealth, then obviously there's profit, which is a company making a profit, et cetera, just very simple. And then there's wages. How much do people make? Of course, if people have wages, but there's no wealth, there's no technology, right? Like no matter how much money you have, you can't buy a computer that isn't invented, right? You can't you need that, right? And if there's no potential to make a profit, then whatever wage you have ultimately just becomes your savings or your net assets, and it can't grow. You can't do anything with it, right? But let's say you have profit, but that never translates into wages. Well, people don't have money to spend, so profits are probably going to collapse, and there are probably going to be a lot of limits to the wealth that people can access, right? But let's say you have wealth, but you don't have any profits, then that wealth or wages, then that wealth may not be sustainable. You might not be able to maintain it, and the infrastructure falls apart, right? So you seem to need, to speak very generally, these three things. But here's a problem. Profit really, really wants to get rid of wages because the first thing that businesses want to do is cut labor, because that's one of arguably your biggest expense, right? So if you can cut labor, you're going to cut labor. Well, so if you need all three of those, and profit's kind of in conflict with wages, it's going to figure out a way to get wages down, dang it. And really great way to do that is to offshore, right? To send the jobs abroad, right? But then if people in your country or certain classes don't have wages, then they're looking at profits going up and going, none of that has anything to do with me. I have no access to that profits. They're seeing the wealth go up and say, yeah, that wealth is in major cosmopolitan areas, but it's not in Gretna. It's not in small town. The wealth is almost a taunt. It almost feels like it's taunting you, right? Because you don't have access to it or different things. And if people say, well, just go get a good paying job, where? Where should I go to a different country? Like how? Oh, you should go to college. Oh, okay. And then you have the social contract. So when wages go down, you have threats to the social contract, right? Because people don't believe in it. So there are things too with the tariff conversation that, in my opinion, just as an opening frame, it's just a way I've been thinking about it, and I'm not even claiming some sort of expertise that has all of the answers or anything. But for me, I don't even know if you can think about a topic like tariffs if you don't have those kind of tensions in mind when you think about capitalism, because all you can think about is profits go down. Well, that must mean wages go down and wealth go down. Well, no, profits can go up and wages stagnate. Wages could go up and profits go down. Wealth could increase and wages and profit actually hit a certain equilibrium. There are a whole lot of tensions there that have to be thought. And I just think that what we're seeing is basically a lack of capacity to even think those sort of tensions. I'd be curious any thoughts that come to mind.
Yeah, as you were describing that, I was thinking of a three-legged stool, and
Mm.
each of the legs is cognizant of the role it plays in holding up the stool. It feels the weight of the stool that it holds up, and it goes, you know what would help me do a better job? Being longer and bigger. But if one of the legs gets much longer and much bigger than the other legs, not only will the stool no longer work, but it will topple over.
I think it's a beautiful metaphor. And that's exactly what I think you're seeing. And if there's an argument to be had that you've had, I don't know, decades, certainly decades of capitalism that has emphasized profit and wealth at the expense of wages, and you have a very lopsided stool. But perhaps if you're sitting on that side of the stool where you feel like you're just going up and you're not looking down at the slide, but then in order to correct it, it's going to feel like a slide as you go backwards, right? And it's going to have this sort of dramatic shift that's going on. Now, of course, the arguments against, I suppose the strong arguments against tariff gets into things like causing war. You could say that this sort of fluctuation in credit markets could cause banks to fail. It could have unintentional consequences in the finances. Usually, when you have this much volatility on the VIX, banks can fail. You could argue, I guess, if treasuries go up, there can be pluses and minuses, or other countries. I guess China has a stockpile of gold. They could transfer, I believe, their dollar into gold, although I don't know all the details. So there are unintentional consequences that can occur. And you could argue that tariffs, also, I suppose you could argue that the economy is complex, not complicated, which is a distinction you hear, in complexity science or whatever. Complexity is that of which if you break it, you can't bring it back. So Jim Rutt makes the example where something that's complicated, like like a car engine, if it breaks, you could theoretically get the parts and fix it and bring it back. And so it's complicated, but it's not complex. Whereas I'm complex in the sense that it's a violent example, but it's what Mr. Rutt uses. If you blend me up in a blender and put me in a bathtub, you're never going to get Daniel again, right? There is no amount of assembly that is ever going to bring Daniel back. And you could argue that the global economy is complex. And if you bring this sort of shock to it, it could cause, it could cause the thing to break and you won't be able to bring it back, right? That could be the argument against it. But then, of course, basically that would mean, hey, people that aren't making any wages and don't have any jobs, it's almost cold. It's like debt deterrence. It's like econ deterrence, right? It's like a new Cold War against people that work. It's like, you better accept this or, we're all going to die. So, get over it, right? And that doesn't, that almost makes me think about, we don't worry about legitimization anymore. Now it's just, we're all going to die if you don't, right? It's like apocalyptic justification I'm thinking about now. But let me throw it back at you.
Yeah, one of the things that COVID seems to have done is to have persuaded certain people that the economy is not complex, it's complicated.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
you can break it and break it
Mm-hmm.
on purpose and then bring it back and manage those consequences to the point where they're not so onerous that you can't politically survive. The other thing related to this that I've been thinking about is temporality and
Mm,
time preferences. It seems to me that this is an issue where time is a huge factor in everything everybody's doing, but it's almost not discussed at all.
mm,
So, for instance, the president sits on an electoral timeline that greatly shapes and affects the decisions he can make, right? The first year of a presidential term is usually the year of activity because by the second year, everybody's scared about the midterm. And that skittishness about the midterm makes it harder to act. And often, if you've done anything in the first year that was unpopular, you're trying in some way to make up for it, to set yourself up for that midterm. If you blow that midterm, which usually you do, most of the time you do blow the midterm, then in the third year, you can't do very much. And so then by the fourth year, when you're running for re-election or the next presidential cycle is up, you are really running on the long-term or medium-term effects of what you did in the first year. And that's how I would interpret this. I think that the president has decided that he's not going to do well in the midterm anyway, that the midterms are a bad bet in general. And to plan the first year around the midterm would be a mistake. It would limit the amount that he would ultimately be able to do. He's 78. He is unlikely, barring crazy changes in the way the system works, to be able to run again. And then also just due to age, he's unable to be able to run again. You know, somebody who's 82 would really struggle, I think, to complete an additional presidential term. In any case, certainly a 78-year-old cannot confidently predict that they'll be able to be president when they're 84 or 85 or 86. So what does that do? Well, it means that I think he has a time preference for doing everything in the first year as quickly as possible. And then his hope is that by 2028, it will be evident that he will have made the right decisions. And
mm.
he's been using language of adjustment period, which is the kind of thing a politician says when they are going to sacrifice an election. They're going to do something that's very politically damaging. They know that it's going to be politically damaging, but they want to do it anyway. There's an old show, Yes, Minister, from the 80s,
Yeah.
and there's a bit where the civil servant, Sir Humphrey, says, if you really don't want a politician to do something, you must tell him it's courageous. You know, because political courage means you're going to lose the election. The thing is, if you are term limited, you don't care that much about the possibility of winning another election. In the first Trump administration, when COVID hit, he panicked about getting reelected and backed off the trade war in 2020, totally ran away from it. He had started to move toward this, but in 2018, 2019, they were still trying to talk to China. They were negotiating with China. They thought there might be some possibility of making a new arrangement together with China, but they were convinced by that process of negotiation that China was not a credible partner.
Mm.
This is not to say that the individual Chinese diplomats were dishonest or conducting themselves in bad faith, but the observation was that these diplomats were not being backed by Beijing. So if they made concessions in a meeting, Beijing would nullify those concessions. And Beijing would nullify those concessions without being clear that they were doing that. They would try to sneak nullifications past the American diplomats with subtle changes in the language. And so this broke down the trust between the United States and China during that first Trump term and produced an attitude of, I think neoliberalism without China as ultimately the goal. China is no longer considered a good faith actor. So that means now, when China tries to talk, the administration is seeing this as stalling behavior on the part of China rather than as a real effort to make a deal that might actually be win-win negotiation, as Chinese diplomats like to say. And that means, now there's a question of, well, how quickly are you going to cut China out of the international system? If your view is that China doesn't follow the rules and isn't reliable, then, and you have a concern about China as a rising power in the system that is potentially a rogue actor, then you're looking at gradually reducing the role that China plays in the system in a way that's minimally disruptive. But what if your time preference is such that you want to do that faster? I think at the start of all of this, I thought it would look more like 2019, 2020. I thought there would be some trade tit for tat to gradually ramp up a little bit of this decoupling. But I figured they would try to do the decoupling in a way that was still compatible with competing in the midterm. So they would do it slowly. They would do it not very much. But the thing that's been wild about this administration is that they seem to have a time preference that is very different from what many people assumed. Their time preference is much shorter. And so they are really trying to do this fast. And they're doing it so fast that it's bound to cause major economic disruption. But they don't care. They don't care. They're willing to tank it. And of course, many Republicans in Congress and in the Senate will not be comfortable with that. And there are already 7 senators who have publicly said that they would support qualifying the tariff power, 7 Republican senators, in addition to the Democrats, of course. And there have been half a dozen or so members of the House who have expressed an interest, House Republicans. But the Speaker of the House is not allowing that kind of legislation to advance right now. And because the Speaker is not allowing that legislation to advance, the Speaker is effectively protecting the president from what would otherwise be a congressional mutiny. And it all relies on the Speaker of the House.
Mm.
And so China is trying to ramp it up in response because China is betting that it can get Congress to undermine the president's ability to do this. But if that doesn't happen, if Congress doesn't take away the president's tariff rights or heavily qualify them, then China's decision to ramp it up will just further accelerate the process, even faster than the administration had initially planned. And the state that really will suffer ultimately from getting locked out of the American secured international trade system is China.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of bricksters out there who think that China can run its own system. And I think that this is going to be a kind of hard test of that theory. And I think my expectation, because I'm not a productivist, I'm not what I like to call a 21st century physiocrat who thinks that all wealth comes from making things. I think at this point, many countries can make things. Making things is not the most important role a country can play in the system. In the 1700s, when Britain was industrialized and nobody else really was, yes, being a producer conferred a huge advantage, but not anymore. It's a different world today, and being a producer is a path to being a middle-income country, but it's not a path to being a truly rich country. And you can see that in terms of the consumption, final consumption per capita. People think of China as having become this wealthy state, but China is only able to consume about 6 or 7 grand per capita. And for comparison, the United States consumes about 43 or 44 grand per capita. There is no country anywhere close to the United States in terms of per capita final consumption. The very, very most consumption-heavy European states, for one, they're very small states like Luxembourg, they consume around 32, 33 grand per head. And then if you're looking at big European states like Germany or Britain, you're really talking about only around 25. So the European Union does not consume anything like the same amount. And this means there's just a ton of different sectors where there is no customer apart from the United States. And if you have industry that is based on the premise that you're going to be able to trade with the United States, that's going to lead to a lot of production, which cannot easily continue to function without the American as the customer.
Magnificent. You said a lot that's very important. First off, I think the point you made about COVID suggesting the global economy is complicated, not complex, is spot on. It is actually quite difficult for me to imagine the tariffs being in effect without COVID. I think also there's a bit of assumption that if the Federal Reserve has interest rates where it does, and I think they pause QE or QV, there's different ones. There's an idea that if something happened, the Fed has plenty of tools that they could actually bring. So that also increases.
That's the role 2008 played in this too. It showed that they have monetary tools. They actually built their confidence that they can manage crisis over 2008 and 2020, which is wild.
Yes. And I think that's also a part of this because there's this notion that, okay, well, if, so for example, if you have trouble in the credit market, which credit market is a very loaded term, we could be talking credit swaps and et cetera, so forth, that the Fed can do a whole lot. And there's also an idea that there's a question, are tariffs inflationary or deflationary? A lot of people are saying inflationary, but it's actually not so clear because you could have a deflationary result because there is less goods being created, actually, or you could have the cost of the dollar might actually go up and it's able to buy more for less, right? There's a lot of unknowns when it comes to what side is it going to be? Is it going to be inflationary or deflationary when it comes
Yeah,
to the effect of tariffs?
it depends on whether people continue to buy the same stuff, even though it costs more money, or do they respond by consuming much less?
Yeah.
If they consume less in response to the tariff, then you would get to a point where the tariff has potentially a contractionary or recession-inducing effect.
Yes.
But one of the things that people used to talk about was this idea that you had a political business cycle. And this is something that Trump has effectively returned to. The idea in the political business cycle is that you make your recession, if you're going to have one, in the first year of your presidential term. So that by the time your term is up, you are presiding over a recovery. If you're able to get a V shape, then you can do it on the kind of temporal window that's compatible with the political cycle. The problem with 2008 was that it was this U-shaped or even K-shaped recovery that didn't look like the standard recovery and so wasn't something you could politically work with on the timeline of a term. But the COVID cycle looked a lot more like that, a lot more like that. It was much closer to the point where, if the election had been held maybe a year later, Biden might have done significantly better. Or, for instance, if Trump had hung around an extra year, and the whole thing was delayed by about a cycle, I think that it could have changed very much the results of these elections. This kind of thing we really haven't talked about in a long time because people, I think, largely assumed after the Federal Reserve became politically independent and the central banks around the world became politically independent, that this central bank independence would get rid of the political business cycle. But if you're able to use other kinds of policy apart from monetary policy to play this game, the assumption was that fiscal policy, it would be too difficult to do it with stimulus or with spending packages. But if you can find a way to really affect the way the global economy works without increasing your spending or cutting your spending substantially, now you have a very different kind of political situation.
No, I think that's brilliant. I think it's a certain return of fiscal policy, which we actually have kind of forgotten about, other than, trade agreements. That's okay. Maybe that's fine. Our new laws or getting rid of regulations or stuff like that. But really, our toolbox of fiscal options have always basically been on the side of hurting wages. They've been more so to help profit. And you've also been able to get away with that, you could argue, because so many people have retirement funds, 401k, and one of your largest voting blocks are older people, right? And well, I guess they vote more than any other generation, right? So you've also had an incentive to keep profits up. And a lot of those people also, in being older people tend to have more money than younger people. They also probably have wages they're happy with. So they probably have some of the few wages you've got. And so you're going to prioritize their profits on their 401. Please, Studebaker.
Yeah, you're also seeing an interesting time preference in terms of how people are reacting to this. Because if you're someone who is planning to retire in the next year or two, then this temporal window is extremely inconvenient for you because your retirement conflicts with the adjustment period.
Yes.
But if you're someone who's younger, who had no plan to retire anytime anyway, who wasn't looking even to really check any of your retirement accounts for 20 years or so, or 30 years or so in some cases, then you have a time preference that's radically different. And of course, if you have no retirement accounts and you don't have any investments in this market, so far you haven't even felt any of this. It hasn't affected you at all.
No, not at all. And I think also, there are some other factors too, and I've heard a few people say this, that I guess we're refinancing the debt in a few months, or I guess they could do options, but I'm not clear on all the details. And there's a point that if interest rates come down or you've had treasury yield come down, that's hundreds of billions of dollars you're not going to have to be paying on interest. So there's also I think basically Trump also just looking at all of the variables, the possibility of actually being on the recovery by the time you get to elections or later on. Also seeing there's so much money that's being paid in interest. And also, I think basically to make a claim I cannot prove, I think Trump's strategy is I will learn to fly by jumping out the window. It is not that I learn to fly and then jump out the window. I will jump out the window and that will cause us to learn to fly. Likewise, I will break everything, and that will actually force us to think things we otherwise would not, because there's something about motivation. Like if there's always a problem of political will, right? How do you create political will? You almost seemingly cannot, especially once it gets captured by institutional incentives like a Mercedes Olson or, K Street or whatever. So it's like if we want to create political will, there's only one way to do it: jump out the window. Then there will be political will to fly. Then there will be political will to do things you otherwise would not be willing to do. But otherwise it will not. And I kind of feel now this is just analyzing his temperament. I do wonder if Trump's entire strategy for making him do things is to basically create something that forces him to do it, or for like break something or jump into something. You have no idea how to do it. Maybe this is why you're bankrupting all the time, but you're also having big. There's this jump in and then find out, which is almost in some respects can be a strategy to create motivation to do things you otherwise would not do because you kind of have to. And perhaps in a temperate sense, that is also not only for the reasons that you described, it may be temperate alignment with how he's actually done many things in his own life. Although I don't want to push that too far, but that's sort of a feeling I get. I'd be curious any thoughts you might have.
Yeah, there is a kind of one of the things we've seen recently is this sense that you can't really legitimate major political action unless it seems like there's a crisis or an emergency that's been imposed upon you. If you make a crisis or emergency with your behavior, people become very angry. If it seems to be something you picked or something you chose, people become very angry. So politicians have gone to great lengths to at least present anything that happens as something that's been externally imposed upon them. And this sometimes leads to conspiracy theories by people who suggest that politicians have secretly planned all the emergencies and crises, because otherwise it would seem like nothing would ever happen or be able to be accomplished. This really breaks with a lot of our usual patterns because it is very, very overtly a crisis that the president has deliberately created intentionally, knowing full well that it will be very costly for many people. And so there is great anger with him. And also, some people have to insist that it must be stupid or it must be irrational because they can't imagine if they were the president doing anything other than just trying to keep things stable and normal. They can't imagine that they would try to do anything very big. Anything that you would do that would be very big would upset people and cause problems and could be portrayed as making a crisis or destroying things. And that's not to say that people should support the action specifically. It's more to comment on an inability to have a political mindset in which action is even on the table. For a lot of people, just the fact that the president is obviously doing things is a problem. The president should be managing stuff that happens and preventing. The president should be a manager rather than a doer. He should manage the things that are happening to the country and prevent them from affecting you, as opposed to someone who makes decisions on the basis of maybe beliefs about what would be better for the country, maybe ideals or some kind of vision of what the country could be. That people don't have tolerance for that.
No,
So a lot of presidents who do have things they want to do have to dress it up as they made me do it.
yeah. No, I think that's exactly right. And I think basically, that way of doing things is, in some respects, perhaps you could argue Trump tried that in his first term. He tried to kind of go along, and found that it was not adequate. I think it's also, again, I think there is something about also, if you are, there's an argument to be made that politicians, I know people all the time talk about deals, right? And Trump loves deals and different things. And I don't want to overplay that because that can be romanticized a bit. But there is something about, perhaps there is a difference in the way a politician makes deals versus perhaps sort of a business person will make deals. And that difference could be a big, like, so for example, the politician is often building consensus, right? How do I get consensus, make sure I got the votes, 51 or whatever, to make sure I can pass the law? And really, you're not making deals, you're passing laws often. Again, there are, of course, deal elements to passing laws, but there's a different kind of way of thinking about it, right? Whereas when you pass a deal, it is live. Like, making the deal is the beginning. In some respects, passing the law is the end. You can then forget it and move on to the next thing. But there's levels to a deal, which is, we're going to set the playing field, and then we're going to negotiate within that, right? And it has a different sort of fire to it, a different sort of attitude. Often, I suppose, for politicians, now anything I'm saying right now, I'm just kind of supposing. I don't want to overstate it. But often the leverage people have against politicians is the election. You'll lose election, right? But the idea of creating new leverage beyond that doesn't exist, that's really not so much a certain calculus, right? Because the threat is quite similar that you're dealing with. But the idea of actually creating a situation by breaking things that actually then change the, dare I say, game theory dynamic, because I suppose you could argue that Trump basically created a prisoner's dilemma, basically. Like, if all of the nations teamed up against America, this would be very bad. But the assumption was that would not occur, that some nations would break and make a deal with America, and therefore the best strategy for everyone to team up against America would not take, as the prisoner's dilemma famously says, if both sides do the same thing, you're good to go, but someone's gonna break, and once they break, you've lost the best possible option. I think basically Trump created whether he knew it or not, he has created a prisoner's dilemma, negotiating now, in that he's, you could say, flanked or outflanked, maybe not. More will have to be said with China. But that sort of idea of creating the board with different leverage is also perhaps something we are not familiar with in politics. Now, I don't mean to say there isn't sort of you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back in politics, but there might be a certain difference in that sort of disposition that has cut out thinking political possibilities. Like, it's just kind of cut from our mind even thinking these possibilities. Because, I mean, basically, and you've spoken about it before, there's an idea that an active politician just ruins everything. It's the trauma of the French Revolution, right? If we actually do something with politics, we're all going to die, right? Well, then we better hope that tension between, wealth, profit, and wages takes care of itself. But if that doesn't take care of itself and wages get destroyed, and then you say, well, we can't do anything because it will be the French Revolution, well, then I suppose we're just awaiting our techno Cthulhu, as Mikey Downs talks about in his new book.
You wait for an emergency, then it's harder actually to do it. And then oftentimes the deficiencies in the activity in the emergency further reduce confidence in the capacity of people to do stuff. Whereas if there had been more confidence in the capacity of people to do stuff at an earlier point and stuff had been done, you wouldn't have gotten to the stage where you had the emergency and the action was then as difficult as it was. The thing that's wild is, as you were pointing out, 2008 and 2020 were both emergencies, but those emergencies increased rather than decreased the confidence of policymakers in their ability not just to manage emergencies, but to generate them and then perhaps go through them in some way. I think one of the top level political skills that very few politicians ever get is time management. A sense of time, a sense of how time works in politics, and then also, how do you bury the lead? So if you make a big enough mess, then you get into a situation where if you take some of the mess away, people feel like it's back to normal. Even if you've left part of the mess there, the most important part, the part that you care most about. So in this case, and he's done this a couple of times, first with the rounds of tariffs on Canada and Mexico, he announces a bunch of sweeping stuff. People freak out about it. Then he delays for a window of time, not he doesn't permanently revoke, but he delays many of the elements of what he initially announced, but always leaves the tariff on China higher than it was before, substantially higher. And each of these tariff hikes on China would have been, if announced by itself, a complete game changer policy, because each of these tariffs on China is bigger and more uh, across the board inclusive than any of the tariffs he previously imposed or which Biden imposed during his administration. So each time he leaves this here, people go, oh, it's not going to be that bad. But actually, he has done more in each of those instances than he ever did with regard to trade in the first term. Each time, we have now had 3 separate instances of a tariff hike on China, each of which individually would have been a transformative, the most important event by far of his first term had it taken place then. And that is really, really clever, that the markets are going to rally when the tariff on China is going to go up that much. Wow.
I think, well, it's funny you say all that. And you also made some very important points about how they basically don't trust China because the diplomats lost their credibility. I think that's an untold part of the story. Unfortunately, as I understand it, although it's more just hearsay from people I know who have worked in that, there is the Chinese can sometimes be famous for pulling out of deals at the last minute. Or you work with them for years and years and you think you're going somewhere and then they do not, right?
And this is their time management. They are great at stalling.
Yes,
The
they are.
Americans have figured out that the Chinese diplomats like to stall by talking. And
Yes.
for that reason, they're no longer willing to play the game.
No, and there's always that idea that China thinks in centuries while America thinks in, months or 4 years. And that's always said in a certain positive light that America is short windowed. We don't see the big picture while China does. Well, there's trade-offs to everything. There's pluses and minuses. It makes it easier to stall if you think in centuries. It makes it easier to put off. And also, if you're worried about the long-term impact of everything you do, it's paralysis, right? Because you can never know the long-term impact of everything you're going to do, right? It's not like you can perfectly model out a decision, right? So if you overly think about the future or the legacy or whatever, then that could hinder development, right? That could hinder different things. And also, if you're scared to death, if I make a mistake, the CCP will be angry with me or I'll get in trouble. That also is going to, well, it's always easier to not make a decision than make a decision, right? Especially if there are certain pressures, cultures, and different things like that are at play. So please, Studebaker.
Yeah. People are always saying China thinks in centuries, but China has no ability to manage a very, very acute short-term political crisis because it doesn't have elections. And
Correct.
that's the part of the Chinese system which can compel sometimes a short-term preference on the part of the Chinese state. It's often under discussed, but if you're talking about a short-term political crisis, in the United States, there's a mechanism for managing that, which is an election in which the ruling party takes a bath. Trump, in announcing all of these tariffs, has committed himself to seeing his party take a bath in the midterms. And he can endure a level of unpopularity that greatly exceeds what Xi Jinping can endure because Americans will go, we're going to vote against you in the midterms. We're going to get you in the midterms. Ha, ha, ha. But if a similar kind of shock happens in China, there is no option for the Chinese people apart from street demonstrations and potential confrontation. They don't have a mechanism for punishing the government for botching this process. And this greatly restricts the amount of risk that China can safely tolerate.
I'm so glad you said that. This is a very important point because, again, it's all trade-offs and it all creates unintended consequences. So there's this idea of stability and, oh, we're stable and it'll last through time. Well, that actually increases the probability in different ways of instability, right? Because then people are like, well, because what an election does is make you wait. You say, I'm really pissed off, But I'll, rather than go to the streets and risk my life and going to prison and everything, I'll just wait to vote them out, right? So it actually creates it can create a longer window, actually, paradoxically. And so,
Yeah,
but
if the
those
government is willing to lose the election, which the thing is, generally governments are not,
are not.
democratic governments are not willing to blow an election, but it looks like he is.
Yeah. No, I think that's a key point. Well, so to all of this, so excellent points. My dear beloved friend Lorenzo, he's wonderful, and he does a lot of work on collective intelligence, game theory problems, stuff like that. Wonderful guy, and he did a really fascinating paper, and he also has a TED talk that kind of describes some of the details on collective intelligence, neurodiversity, and game theory problems. And basically, the argument is the following. Um, Neurodiversity, which by that, he's talking about obviously Down syndrome, Asperger, different ways of thinking, right? The point that the research shows is that collective intelligence that is not sufficiently neurodiverse ends up in game theory problems. Actually, Nash equilibria, a situation where everyone does what's rational and therefore you get a suboptimal result. I also like to call it a rational impasse. It's a place where rationality can't get you beyond it, right? But actually, when you introduce neurodiversity, you're much more likely to overcome these Nash equilibria situations because people are willing to do things. They just say, well, this is how we're going to do it. They're not thinking about the social, political cost. They're like, this is the best thing, and that's what we're going to do. And they simply don't feel when everyone freaks out or gets upset. It doesn't bother them as much, for example, right? Or they're just able to see things that other people are not able to see. So the idea is that neurodiversity becomes really important for your ability to actually, in systems management or whatever, to actually not run into Kenneth Arrow preference, all of these different things, right? So, so you want some neurodiversity. So here's the funny idea. Everyone talks about Trump being like a sociopath, basically. He doesn't really feel people, he doesn't care about other people. Well, guess what? If you have a political game theory problem, that's actually exactly the kind of person that might be able to get you through it, right? Where if real political change that could help wages requires doing something that no one has ever, people don't do, it seems crazy to throw away midterms. It seems crazy to throw away elections. Well, someone who's maybe a sociopath is like, yeah, but that's how I don't feel it. It doesn't bother them. They're more, you could even say the egotism that makes them so sure they're right. Actually, then in that sort of situation could be the variable that gets you through something that's otherwise, for more neurotypical people, going to be an impasse. Now, of course, there's a dark side to this, where the person who is, of course, doesn't really feel or care so much what other people think, then does something that is really bad and you can't stop them precisely because they're not as good as inputs. And I'm not trying to say that Trump doesn't care at all what other people think. I'm not trying to paint him as some sort of monster. But if there's some truth to the idea of there being the sociopath, which one, you could argue that if you're a high-level organization or you're a leader in really intense situations, the ability to be like Ulysses, putting the wax in your ear and just go with it, can be really important. Unless you put your wax in your ears and you're going toward the whirlpool or whatever, that might not be good. But in certain situations, the ability to just do something and steer ahead can be very advantageous. And so there's something just very interesting where I just think about looking at Trump and what's going on, seeing a bit of this game theory versus neurodiversity element that Lorenzo is bringing up that you've not seen. But actually, it's just very interesting. If everyone's saying the system is bad, the system's not working, well, systems tend to, almost by definition, be collective things that generate game theory problems. And obviously, game theory problems is a loaded category, and there are many particular kinds of game theory problems. But if you grant it to me, the greater and more complex the entity, the more you are going to get mixed incentives that give you game theory problems. And if that's what you're dealing with and you don't like the system, then neurodiversity that would be able to get you through a rational impasse can be very advantageous, or suicidal, of course, but it also can be, it's just very interesting because Lorenzo's work, not, on a theoretical and testing level, basically shows you that these major mixed incentive problems that you have in an organization basically can only be addressed by an introduction of neurodiversity. Or I know in your book, you talk about the great leveling, and you could have those as well, which is an external shock, existential shock that forces change, but within it, neurodiversity can play an interesting role. But let me throw it back at you.
Yeah, I would be inclined to broaden it out a little bit and just talk in terms of people with different kinds of capacities.
Yes, they
We get so
absolutely,
used to
absolutely.
a certain kind of politician who is a lawyer, who comes through a particular kind of professional class incentive system, thinks like a kind of rump professional, successful professional, and is therefore highly responsive to the set of incentive structures that they encounter as they go up through the schooling system and then the university system and then into the political party. And if you're a career politician, if your ambition is to be a politician, then the loss of the election is an existential crisis in your life. It's a case in which you didn't follow the incentives effectively enough to be able to stay in. And then this makes you wonder, am I even able to do what it is that I do? If you have other kinds of people, whether worse people, better people, different people, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be good. They just have to be different in some way, shape, or form. Then this increases the ability potentially to resist those kinds of incentives, right? When you're in school, there are some people who won't do the things that the teacher says, even though this seems to be obviously the way to get ahead. And the same goes for at later stages. There are people who, at various points in this system, to varying degrees, get off the ramp of just doing what the incentives say, and who at some point or other go, this conflicts in some way with my values. I'm not going to be so pragmatic. I'm going to do something that other people might regard as unreasonable or irrational, but I don't care. All of the really interesting stuff, both bad and good, comes from this kind of thing. And it's what prevents the whole system from being completely predictable.
Brilliant. Absolutely. The term that I'll use in belonging again to one after discussing Lorenzo's work is menti-divergent, because neurotypical is more, genetic or different things. So it's the idea.
Virtues and vices too. Just having certain virtues or certain
Yes.
vices, plays an enormous role. And which kind of love motivates you? What kind of drive do you have? Pragmatism is not the only drive. In Adorno's, negative dialectics, he complains about how there's a kind of pragmatism that has corroded any kind of metaphysics that would seem to give rise to real values. It certainly will seem that way from within the university system, because in the university system, everybody is incredibly pragmatic. Everybody is just trying to get ahead and following all of the rules. The university system is the capital of pragmatism in the economy, together with the corporation. These are the most incentive heavy, rationality heavy kinds of organizations. But there are lots of people who are excluded or to various degrees not perfectly optimized for those environments, who are motivated by other kinds of things and can make decisions on alternative bases.
Brilliant. Absolutely agree. And the problem is if you don't have that mixture of complexity, then in a way you don't have a dynamic environment of incentives, and therefore the incentives become very linear. Like I always reference a little fable by Kafka where the mouse is stuck in a hole. It becomes very tracked, right? So we always talk about the importance of a business ecosystem that has many different businesses, lots of competition, is very, very vibrant. But if the incentives are actually all pragmatistic, basically, or the incentives of all are for increasing profit, well, then actually it's not a dynamic environment. It's not a dynamic economy, actually, because the incentives are actually where the dynamicism comes. If you have a lot of variety in the kinds of businesses following those incentives, it creates a appearance of dynamicism and diversity, but actually it's extraordinarily limited. And then I would also argue, as the solo residual, this radical question of after we take into account growth, productivity and savings and all that, like 30 to 50% of the economy, apparently we can't tell you where it comes from, right? Because it doesn't fit into our models. I think the Robert Solow residual is a very important notion. I would argue, without defending it necessarily at this moment, that a lot of the residual results from alternative incentives to people's behavior that makes them creative or makes them invent things or make them try new things. Like the residual often reflects how much your economy is actually dependent on a greater diversity of incentives, whereas, say, just productivity and growth often just reflect pragmatic incentives. And so that's actually what you end up doing, ironically, in the name of a vibrant economy. When you make everyone pragmatists, on average, you're making it 30 to 50% less wealthy. So it's great, right? There's a great irony in that. It actually also brings to mind there was the part where you were talking at Platypus where people are basically like, if you're not an engineer, what good are you, right? There's this kind of idea that if you're not in there, well, if you're an engineer, you can't deal with you're stuck in your game theory problems and you're stuck in your incentives. Basically, the people who are, say, doing philosophy, who are doing this kind of work, one of the great advantages is they're actually able to help you get through Nash equilibria situations. They're actually able to introduce new incentives that if you cannot introduce, you're basically going to inevitably end up with a lack of capacity that works all well and good until you run into a situation where that lack of capacity means you're in huge trouble or you're stuck in a certain well, usually, unfortunately, what can occur is like T.S. Eliot said, right? Not with a bang, but with a whimper. It's just this kind of whimpering on, and basically when we hear a bang, we go, that's bad. But it's funny because obviously in Eliot's Hollow Man poem, a bang would be a great thing. The problem is you didn't hear a bang. Therefore, you ended up with a whimper, right? So there's something about the ability to actually deal and introduce different incentives that is necessary for the socioeconomic system to have a vibrant ecosystem. And if you only have engineers or people who aren't thinking the good or metaphysics or different things, then the range of incentives for human action will be limited, and therefore the dynamicism and complexity of the system, the emergences of the system, if you even want to use that language, will be very limited. The unexpected things that arise will actually just be repetitions of the same. They won't have that little bit of delusion excess that can be creative. And I should also just note, and then I'll give it to you, like for me, menti divergence is absolutely on the idea of the ability to think different incentives, different capacities, because I don't want to appropriate the idea of neurodiversity. But if Lorenzo is correct about neurodiversity being critical for overcoming game theory problems, then to the degree neurotypical people can become more menti divergent, which stands in for then talking about things like the ability to think the beautiful or the good or the orbiting, or there are many different languages that can be used. That is fundamentally a capacity matter. And if you cannot gain those capacities, you are stuck in the incentives that are presented to you. And if those incentives are leading to a great stagnation or a collapsing of wages, there's nothing you can do about it. So you have to introduce new capacities. And basically, for me, what this would all suggest is that if all we have is a society of engineers, then we cannot escape these game theory problems. We cannot overcome rational impasses. And we better hope, but I wouldn't make this bet, that the non-dynamic incentives won't eventually lead us to something bad that we don't want to go. But that's a bad bet because we just learn in basic, well, again, complexity science, the likelihood of the system continuing is radically tied to its fundamental diversity. Not the diversity within it, but at its very fundamental. If you can have a system that is fundamentally diverse, it is more anti-fragile, as Taleb says. Although, so it's more vibrant, right? So it is. So then this all means, and I'll give it to you, that it is very impractical to actually have only one kind of incentive structure because the system is more fragile if you do that, right? And the lack of metaphysical thinking, the lack of philosophies, et cetera, so forth, actually lends the system to fundamentally being very flat, very similar, self-sameness. And that means it cannot be dynamic. And if it cannot be dynamic, then looking at Robert Solow, then 30 to 50% of your economy is 30 to 50% less wealthy than it could be. And that seems really impractical. If you're really obsessed with making money and stuff, then that doesn't sound good. You really should, give philosophy their time, right? So let me throw it at you.
Yeah, capitalism would never survive simply on the basis of pragmatic energy. Nothing can survive simply on the basis of pragmatic energy. You have to find some way to trigger, generate, tap into other kinds of human energies. And capitalism typically does this with energies that are easy for lots of people to find, like the erotic and honor and status, time, in Greek. The desire for recognition and the desire to have a good time, those are things that capitalism is very good at tapping into. And the people who work in marketing, who work in the tapping into these other energies, play an incredibly important role in capitalism. Without them, without their ability to find ways to tap those energies, people would not buy enough stuff. The thing about the United States is that incredible work that has gone into messing with Americans to the point at which they will buy so much garbage. We have a situation where by and large, women in this country feel that if they don't buy an enormous amount of cosmetic products, that they will be ugly and no one will love them. Somebody had to make them think that, create in them this feeling that if they don't do that kind of consumption, that there will be something fundamentally unacceptable about them. And this has gone on, now you're seeing it with, gym bros, and there's so many different areas of the economy where this takes place, where somebody's crafted some kind of narrative that if you don't do a bunch of stuff, you're going to die, or you're going to not be cool, or people aren't going to love you. And of course, it's all horrible stuff. The thing is, these ways of thinking are distributed so widely throughout the society that there is a sense in which they become true. It becomes actually the case that if you go out in public and you don't wear makeup, people will say, "Wow, you look tired," and they won't, consider you to be, as much a person in society. They won't treat you quite the same way. And the same is true if you don't go to the gym enough, you don't do this, you don't do that. It actually becomes the case on some level that these narratives become true if they're so widely disseminated throughout the market. And people around the world don't understand this is the most horrible thing about the United States, but it is its most powerful economic advantage. It is the reason why all of this consumption can only go through the United States and nowhere else. In no other part of the world have people been so thoroughgoingly immiserated by capitalism that they will spend in the ways in which Americans will spend.
No, is it Robert? He wrote the book I think Animal Spirits or Irrational Exuberance. Robert, he's out of Harvard, I think. I think he put out a book called Narrative Economics that basically wants to argue that narratives are now the main driver of capital markets and that there's a certain narrative that is put forth that then trains behavior and consumption. So then, of course, what is the value of story? Seems to be really quite high, right? And so if you want to say story is not practical or that's a waste of time, well, famously, of course, modern marketing after, I guess, the 1950s is influenced by, what is it, Freud's cousin or something, that he was bringing a lot of psychoanalysis into marketing. I've never researched that heavily myself, but that's something that is put forth, which of course is very interesting because then that of which seems impractical ends to be quite powerful. Please.
We've reached a point where adults will buy toys, adults will buy plastic stuff made in Asia, in sweatshops, and they'll do it because these toys have great meaningfulness. They allow them to get out of their adult life that they can't stand and to engage in a kind of nostalgic mood that gives them some level of relief. That's crazy. Around the world, adults don't buy toys. Only we do this. Mm-hmm. Only we do it. And to some degree, the Europeans, but not as much. Their houses aren't as big. They can't fit as much stuff. They don't have as much room.
No, I think that's exactly, and that, but then what's so important to this point, in my opinion, is that you cannot separate consumption from quote unquote meaning, story, value, the, metaphysical principles. Like you can't separate them because people's consumption are tied to their entire worldview, their entire view of self and everything, right? Like, so much of economics, well, we've talked about it before, is that basically we talk about supply and demand. We talk all, and obviously that's a very simplified model, but there is generally the idea that supply creates demand. That supply generates demand. So if you need to get demand up, increase supply, right? And there's a kind of a stimulation. There's that old idea. Now, I think basically, even if we follow Keynes on the idea that at some point the demand curve flattens so much that it's very difficult to stimulate, you get below what I like to call the demand event horizon. Like in the movie Interstellar, they go to the water planet and everything slows down in 5 minutes becomes 20 years. And there's an argument to be made as demand falls that the amount of time it takes to re-stimulate and recover greatly multiplies. So you never want to cross the demand event horizon. And the idea that you can do this is by increasing supply. Keynes mostly in the general theory talks about the investment multiplier, which is slightly different than, say, a money multiplier, because Keynes is also alive, not after Nixon, right? So the notion of stimulating by increasing liquidity is not something he's going to be emphasizing, even though people take that interpretation with his famous burying a glass jar with money in it. They think he's saying throw out money. No, he's basically making the point that if if Egypt could make pyramids without going bankrupt, which are basically worthless, surely we can maybe make a little bit of infrastructure that is wasted and not go bankrupt because people are like, we don't have the money to do that. He's like, if we just like buried bottles with money in it, that would be better than building pyramids, right? And so he's making this idea that there's a multiplier to investment that is often not accounted for if you're simply thinking in terms of can we afford it or not, right? Because the argument you could make, well, but here's the point I would get at. Not the supply can create demand, yes, but also it can lose its stimulating power because people no longer value it or find it meaningful and it doesn't matter to them anymore, right? There has to be a certain narrative around the supply, a certain meaning in the supply that can stimulate the demand. And if that's not there, then you get a flattening curve. Please, Benjamin.
Especially at a high level of abundance. When you have a
Yes.
lot of stuff and a lot of the stuff that's being made is not obviously tied to survival or to very acute biological needs, then you have to create new needs, you have to create demand, and then, the countries that will be the wealthiest are those that are the best at creating new needs and creating demand. And the United States, by far and away, is the excellent country in this category. And it's excellent precisely for all the reasons that people don't like this country. All of the things people hate about this country, all of the greed and the superficiality and the vice are all incredibly important. This is, if you go back to the fable of the bees, Bernard Mandeville, this idea that you actually often get wealthy by encouraging the worst aspects of human behavior. It's very much the case. It's even more the case today than it was when Mandeville wrote it. And so all of the things that make people think, oh, the United States is declining, many of them are the actual reasons why the United States not only isn't declining, but is incredibly still in the position of strength.
Well, brilliantly put. And I should emphasize the point you were making about the notion of tariffs potentially being successful because America is such a powerful consumer on the stage. That is not always appreciated. Like if you cut yourself off from American markets, there's a lot of trouble that you could be in, right? So that changes the dynamics and all. Well, I was also just going to say before commenting on what you just said, that's very important. Another problem is people talk about tariffs good, tariffs bad. Well, what are the details? What kind of tariff, right? There's an idea that tariff is, let's say you're a really hard free marketer, right? Like you're really big into free markets. Well, if a tariff could potentially be used as leveraging to remove tariffs other countries have, isn't that a free market move? Maybe, maybe not. But if you say, well, it destroys credibility and trust, therefore it is bad. Okay, but we have to, it's just very interesting how the discourse is always this very either or-ness when there's many, many questions that have to go into detail. And also, too, I suppose I get frustrated. So many people have that meme of the penguins, right? Oh, he's tariffing countries that don't have any population. Well, ladies and gentlemen, the idea, if I were to guess, the idea would be that if you don't tariff everywhere, they're just going to go there. They're going to have, the plain land in that island, then say it's a product from that country versus China, and you wouldn't have any tariffs or anything, right? So the idea is that you would have to tariff the entire world, or you're going to be leaving open, loopholes or different things, right? But you never hear any.
That would be my guess.
Yes.
It's smuggling through dummy ports that they're worried
Dummy
about.
ports, yeah. Yeah,
And,
that's what
and the thing is, people who criticize it should be aware of this. And I
Yes.
think in some cases they are aware of it. They just don't care. They want to oppose the policy, and they don't mind if they take advantage of the fact that many people haven't thought about trade long enough to realize that there is some possibility of dummy ports.
Yes. No, that's exactly what it is. And so for me, like, again, part of evidence of the lack of political capacity or capacity is the very fact that that notion is not in my opinion, something you hear or is even in the discussions either for it or against it versus, okay, well, if you're going to be talking about, I guess, what, multilateral, bilateral trade agreements, then arguably you would want multilateral tariffs, right? If you want to actually make sure that there are no openings, you would, quote unquote, you would want to make sure that the whole thing is taken. But you don't have that. You have more good, bad, destroy economic activity. Yeah, well, it may destroy profit, but it may increase wages, right? But that is not brought in, please.
There is a real possibility here that when all is said and done, there will be much less trade between the United States and China, but lower tariffs in the rest of the world system. That there could be more free trade outside of China and a stronger kind of neoliberal system
Yes.
outside of China, and maybe a handful of states which buddy up with China and become part of a second world system that is in a position of distress because it won't be sufficiently large, I would expect. Uh, but that's entirely possible. We could end up with genuinely easier trade with the bulk of the countries in the world as a consequence of this. And that's just something that doesn't get considered. That's not to say that I expect that to happen or know that it will happen, but that is a possibility here.
Yes.
And it's one that nobody even discusses.
Well, and I think also on the timescale, I think there is also a notion for Trump, um, if I were to guess, on the idea that you need to do this now before advanced engineering factories are built in Asia for AI and all of these chips. You need to try to get ahead of that before it's developed, because once that's developed, it could be more difficult. It could be too late. China then has a much more advanced drone army, which you could say they already have. Or, I know drone technology has been greatly accelerated because of the Ukraine-Russia conflict. You could argue both of those will be powers there. And there's an idea of advanced engineering that you also want to make sure is not, but this goes back to COVID. I think this is where COVID was such a big deal, because people are like, wait a minute, we don't have any factories, and if the world trade shuts down, we can't make anything. That changed people's mindset about offshoring as well. That was a key factor in people being like, we need to make sure that we have factories here. I'll give it to you. Another consequence of this as well, I'm not as sure about this. People have been, there's also a possibility that you have more economic possibility in Latin and Central America, because if it seems like the tariffs there are lower. That could put an incentive of building factories there, which then, of course, if Central America is richer, that might help with the illegal immigration problem, right? Because that actually would then make people not so desperate, right? So there are all sorts of factors that come into this. And it does seem to me, based on what I understand of the tariffs, although people have been getting very mad at him for Mexico and Canada and all the stuff that he has said, the tariffs actually almost seem, and I would be curious, I might be wrong about this, they almost seem lighter in regard to North America as a whole. I know there's the 10% baseline, but that also could be dealing with actually bringing economic activity to Central America and Latin America, which then helps you with the illegal immigration problem. I'm not sure. Any thoughts on anything?
No, that's a very good point. Latin America, there were several Latin American states that were parties to the original Trans-Pacific Partnership that Obama was trying to negotiate.
Yep.
The pivot to Asia has always included this idea that Latin American countries could be developed in response to all of this. And there is a significant question. To what degree will this be allied states in East Asia? To what degree will it be Latin American states? To what degree will it be reshoring to the United States? To what degree could it be even states in the Middle East or Europe or Africa potentially getting some of the jobs? But yes, one of the things that they are certainly interested in is the possibility of creating economic opportunities in Latin America so that there is less push factor in causing Latin Americans to migrate to the United States. They are very much alive to the possibility that economic development in Latin America would reduce the severity of the immigration crisis. And they very much care about that. That is a sharp insight. It definitely is part of what's going on.
Yeah, well, because one could argue that you ultimately would never address the illegal immigration problem or the border problem unless you help make Central America prosperous. That would be the only way, right? But how are you going to do that if everything's in Asia, right? So, there's also something to be said that tariffs may, there's this idea that a tariff is America first, but it could be North America first in some respects, right? It can actually be bringing economic possibility to regions south of us that otherwise it would not be there. And that's another factor, because if you want to do, because, the system is clearly not making those areas prosperous. Well, if the system is not doing that, then you would perhaps want to introduce something that would increase that potential and possibility. But that is again just another factor that is not considered in the discussion, in my opinion. I think you're right with the transit. I guess Chile, all these countries that were going to be part of that arrangement. And I think also, well, I mean, the other thing too, again, with tariffs, I mean, there are also arguments to be made, and then I'll get back to the narrative economic vice stuff. This is extremely important. Like, there's arguments also to be made if tariffs are deflationary. So let's say tariffs put up your goods 10%. Well, that's a one-time thing, whereas inflation is compounding. So you could say, okay, yes, tariffs is going to put up the good of your product 10% now, but that's it. It's not going to be going anymore. Whereas if you don't do something about inflation, because the cost of if the system is dependent on credit, it's not able to create wages to stimulate, et cetera, so forth. Well, that's two, and that's way worse than a one-time 10%, right? So there are also questions on to what degree is it better to take a tariff hit in order to try to cap compounding inflationary problems, or not, right? And so those are also factors with it that are not always considered, in my opinion. But on also, there was something else, but I'll pause on that. But like you were
Yeah,
saying,
related to the inflation,
please.
just on that point, the pushing down of the interest rates, which is likely to happen if there is deflation or a sharp reduction in the inflation rate, that would alleviate some of the pressure on the housing market in the United States. And that is something younger people would notice.
Yes.
And younger people who are not as concerned about their retirement accounts, at least not right away, are in many cases concerned about housing. And so that is a potential opportunity politically, not immediately, but over the course of several years, depending on how it goes, depending on what the reactions are and whether we end up with inflation from this or deflation.
I think the housing market is an untold variable in this equation that is not being appreciated at all. And I think you could also argue that the major, when the government is finding its, as I understand the data, the major factor in what the government is saying we have inflation is in the housing market. It is in assets. It is not in the grocery store. Yes, eggs are up, but there's a bird pandemic, and they're not up that much compared to where they've been. The main source of inflation is the housing, and you could actually argue that we're seeing deflation in most of the other sectors already, right? Well, if that's true, and you have deflation occurring, then lowering interest rates, which would actually be to some degree inflationary, would be fighting a deflationary curve and bringing down houses, which is actually net beneficial, right? But it depends on how you read the data. And I think there's a very good argument to be said that the majority of the inflation is in the assets. That is not actually in consumer goods, in my opinion. Please.
Yeah, so this is where both 2008 and 2020 potentially work together.
Yes.
So 2008 teaches you how to fight deflation, and 2020 teaches you how to fight inflation that comes from supply chain shocks.
Yes.
And if you combine these together, then you have some level of confidence that you have a toolkit that will be able to get you out of quite serious trouble, regardless of which way it plays or what combination you get. That's not necessarily going to protect you electorally. We saw in 2008 and in 2020 what happens if you get caught electorally at the wrong moment in one of these crises. The ruling party suffers very badly and doesn't do well. But if you've decided that you don't care, you're willing to tank that, and really your question is just, will the whole society come apart? No, there's good reason to think that they can prevent the whole society from coming apart.
Yep. I think understanding what is happening now as a combination of lessons from 2008 and COVID cannot be overstated, because I think that is absolutely what is going on. I think also perhaps Trump has accepted the thesis that crisis is inevitable, that some sort of crisis is occurring. I've heard various people around him even drop the phrase "fourth turning" here and there, from Neil Howe and William Strauss's Generations book in 1993 or whatever. And I guess there's a popular, Neil Howe is more heard on the idea that, there's historical cycles, almost like Ray Dalio is also sort of talking about things. Before I forget as well, what has also been very interesting to me is I have never, ever, 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 ever heard anyone on the mainstream talk about tariffs, that there is a real problem that we need to address, just not this way. You'll never mention that there was a real problem we needed to address until Trump did something, and then suddenly it's like everyone knew this, right? And that's also,
it was there in the Biden administration. So many guys in the Biden administration read that Michael Pettis and Matt Klein book, Trade Wars Are Class Wars. that is a book that people in the establishment debate, discuss, talk about, take very seriously. A lot of regular people have no idea that this was something that was an issue for the Biden administration, was something the Biden administration was actively concerned about. The difference was the time preference.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so suddenly it's like everyone knew something. And I think that's also been in the American people like, well, that I guess you almost get into Overton window stuff, right? Like if you do something out there, it like shifts the entire discourse as if it was there.
It's
And
it's
please.
the thing is trade is just not sexy
Yeah.
unless something is immediately happening
Yeah.
that is really wild, that is going to affect you. The economy goes to the background except when something is going on.
Yeah.
Generally, during the Biden administration, people just wanted to talk about woke and DEI and Ukraine and Palestine. People didn't want to talk about the economy, certainly not media elites. And when they did talk about it, it was just in terms of inflation, really. Just in terms of inflation. It wasn't in a geostrategic context that
Correct.
would make it come alive on some level. And part of what is exciting to people who talk about politics about this moment is that this is the kind of crisis situation which brings together so many different parts of this system that have been talked about separately but not together.
Well, I completely agree. And again, I suppose another argument to be made is that the reason why you need people who are not just engineers is because there's a certain way of thinking that is a capacity necessary for thinking the moments when all the parts come together. Like, if you could argue the grandeur of an engineering, utilitarian, pragmatic mindset is that it focuses on what and makes it happen, right? And it's working with linear systems to make something that can run itself almost, right? But when you have these moments where many factors are coming together, and there's a certain moving, the problem itself is moving, I guess is another thing I want to say. Like in an engineering mindset, which again is extremely important, one could say the problem is more solid. It might be difficult to figure out, but what is the problem can be more solid. Whereas in moments like this, even the act of being able to articulate the problem is a massive, massive step. And if you can't do that, then you're probably just going to stay in the how do we get rid of the tariffs or how do we keep the tariffs? You're not going to be well, you said geostrategic. I mean, the other issue is economics and geostrategy and policy. All of these are together. They're all freaking related. You can't talk about what's good for the economy without also talking about the geostrategic. You can't talk about all of these things together or the particular capacities of people to receive the story and the narrative. They all go together, please.
Yeah. And this is where the weaknesses of the Biden era public discussion, I think, are really evident. For many people in the Biden era, the Gaza thing is its own separate issue, disconnected from anything else. Ukraine is its own separate issue, disconnected from anything else, to the point where you could make a little political grid over which flags do people have in their profile, and you could mix and match in any particular configuration because people treated these things as separate, distinct, alien issues. And the domestic U.S. economy was treated as a separate, distinct alien issue. And then the culture war stuff, each of these things, separate, distinct alien issues. So here, everything comes back together in a way that's really exciting. After all, what does all of this ultimately do? You end up with a situation where you're trying to increase your military spending while cutting taxes internally at the same time. And to do that, you're going to get your allies to spend more on defense, and you're going to fire a bunch of your bureaucrats that you think are unnecessary woke or DEI hires. So all of these things come together in a way that allows you to evaluate interactions as opposed to just having certain particular principles that you have in relation to quite specific isolated elements that don't talk to each other and don't respond in any way to any development. And that's the really frustrating thing when you start talking about trade. People think that trade works like that and that they can just have the technocratically correct position about free trade. Yeah. And once they've got that technocratically correct position, then they don't have to think about it. They can just laugh at anyone who does a tariff in any situation and just go, ho ho, you don't understand comparative advantage. You know, it's a lot of people don't want to think about it and they want to feel better than it. They just want to use it as an opportunity to dunk on everything that's happening and feel in some sense superior to what's going on.
That's exactly right. The libidinal enjoyment of that superiority that's at play, right? It's not about being informed. It's about being able to see the thing in a manner that you enjoy in that
And
way.
then a lot of the political commentators are selling that.
They
And this
sell
is
it.
where we can get into the how does the pragmatism trigger other kinds of energies? If you can make people feel superior to the president or superior to the people who like the president by treating tariffs as just obviously stupid, what a bunch of dum-dums. Aren't you smart because you recognize that they're a bunch of dum-dums? And you're not invited then to understand even what the argument would be for why it's dumb. You're simply invited to agree with the expert television man who's telling you that it's dumb. And you're smart because you trust the expert television man while the dum-dums do not.
That's exactly right. Beautifully said. And so, there's a few things. First off, I think on this idea of the believing trade is simply if you program it right and you have the right quantitative assessments, it just, it takes care of itself in different things. Um, Versus what did you say? The valuating of the relation or the valuating of the interaction, right? There's a few things with that I think is extremely important. First off, Cadell and Davude Gosley had a conversation where they talked about people using data to avoid thinking because I'm just reading the data so I don't have to think, right? Using stats. And this is a real problem in quantitative research because what ends up happening is you're gathering data and then you can say this is what it says and you don't have to think about it. And a lot of what Davude's book in his field is warning against is researchers not thinking. They're not thinking. They're actually creating programs to take out thinking, right? Which again, hey man, if you're dealing with a one-track problem, a linear path where neurotypical is not going to end up in a rational impasse, if the quantitative is all you need, that's great. But if suddenly you come upon something where thinking is needed because the data does not address the concern because it is multi-layered as opposed to layered in a single way, well, then you've been trained into habits that make you incapable of addressing what's presented. Because the problem is, like Dave talks, with sociology, and we talk about habitats, et cetera, so forth. Every field brings with it certain habits, right? Well, if you get into a habit of not thinking and therefore confusing thinking with finding data and presenting data, then you don't have the capacity to do that which is necessary for the valuation of, say, relations or interactions, which if you cannot do, then you cannot have a proper understanding of trade. You certainly can't have good trade agreements, and you're probably just going to be stuck in the tendency of capital to lower wages to increase profit. Because for me, and I know that Marx talks about the iron law of wage, et cetera, so forth. But to me, the central tension, in my opinion, of a central tension of capitalism is that profit is in a war against wages, and it tends to reduce wages, and it also at the same time habituates people into not having the capacity to create wealth alternative from what generates the profit. So you get into a habit of not having the capacities to invent something or to think according to new motivation. So if your wages are going down, but you did have the ability to invent new goods or new values or have new motivations, then you could get an out, right? You'd have an escape hatch, right? Because you could generate something. But if actually the system simultaneously lowers wages while training you out of the capacities of wealth creation, well, then you're stuck and you've got a problem. And profit will ultimately sacrifice both wealth and wages for its own gain. And then, who cares if you've profited if you've lost your soul, right? Please.
And then they'll make all of these stoic appeals. They'll say, well, have creativity and innovate in spite of the fact that we've destroyed the conditions that are conducive for any of that.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, get good and figure it out and be entrepreneurial and move fast and break things, even though we have destroyed the capacities that would enable you to do that well. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of that going on. And there's also people who, if they're not able to deal with the fact that people think in different ways, or that they're driven by and motivated by different kinds of energies, different kinds of loves, then when they meet someone who thinks in a different way or is motivated by a different drive or different kind of love, they can only regard this as a kind of avidity,
Yes.
or even as a kind of mental retardation, to bring it back to your discussion of neurodiversity. And we have a lot of people right now whose response to the tariffs is effectively to just call anyone who doesn't think the way that they think a retard, but to do that with different language so that that isn't what it looks like.
Yeah, and it's a certain way of not having to think about it. Because if anyone who takes the other position is stupid, there's nothing to think. There's always a problem of being right actually being a threat to thinking. Because if you're right, there's nothing to think, right? It's like Blondel in his book Action. That's always stuck with me. He said basically modern philosophy committed suicide when it made its goal certainty. Because when you're certain of something, you stop thinking about it and you stop caring about it too, right? Like you don't tend to care about things that you know. Like the moment you know, you just kind of forget about them and move on. It's that of which you don't know that generates interest and actually generates thinking, right? So when you have this certain sort of defining the other in a manner that they're fooled to think the other side, well, actually, you also, what you judge is what you become. If they're the fool, then actually you become the fool because you don't train the capacity of thinking, right? So you actually become that because you're not creating the contrast that needs to be thought, right? But then, if basically you've been trained by the medium of the laboratory or the college to think thinking is bad and data collecting is good, quantitative numbers is good, then you've also been habituated to associate the lack of thinking with being educated, and then thinking actually being bad, right? So then you get another level of habit training that becomes very problematic. And basically, too, there is something about capitalism. Basically, I guess another way that I put it is that capitalism has not been able, this is a very gigantuous claim that belonging against circles, is that we conflated the categories of stimulating demand and creating demand. Creating demand is not the same as stimulating demand, actually. We've never thought creating demand. Creating demand is new capacities, new menti-divergence, new incentives, right? We actually don't think about that at all. It randomly shows up here and there, and then we benefit from it and say, yes, this is the glory of capitalism. Look, that it created this technology and different things. But you said it very well. Very often these things are actually demonized at the time. Then afterwards, we appreciate them, and we actually don't want new introductions of creativity unless it basically helps what is pre-existing. Like, we like creative destruction as long as it's not fundamental creative destruction. And it's actually just the competition that creates this sort of appearance of development. But when you start talking about fundamental shifts and actually how people think and how they carry themselves as human beings and what they create, that's something that we don't really like. And actually the system doesn't, it actually trains us out of that capacity, which then, if Keynes is right about the problem of demand on the event horizon, if people like Dietrich McCloskey are correct with the great enrichment between, I guess, the 1670s and the 1800s having so much to do with people changing how they talked about ideas and one another, that there was an, dare I say, idealistic shift that then made people, well, try to invent stuff and try to do different societies. That's in the realm of ideas that then became socialized in discussion. That changed everything. You could also talk about, like Lena Anderson talks about the Nordic nations between 1850 and maybe the 1950, and how there's this, they go from being extremely poor to doing very well. I think the Nordic nations are over romanticized now, and so he's actually quite critical of Nordic nations, Denmark, et cetera, so forth now. But between this 100-year period, there's this radical explosion of wealth, and it's tied to the bull dung school system, changing how people think beyond just pragmatistic concerns. And it turns out that when you do that, then people actually generate wealth that's human, not alienating, right? But all of this is in the realm of gaining capacity and what I'm just called menti-divergence. There are many terms I use in the book. I try to use as many terms as possible to be as confusing as I can, precisely so that you don't have a signifier that's overly stable and you have to keep thinking. That seems to be very important. And the great irony is that basically, and then I'll give it to you, basically we associate data collection and not thinking with thinking. Like, we basically associate being educated with avoiding thought. Right? Because if you have to think, you must have did something wrong. Like, if you're thinking, your system must have been bad. You must not have had a good plan. You must not have had the data, right? Like, if you're thinking, it must mean you didn't you didn't have a good plan. And this is where I make the distinction between preparing and planning. We're basically under the tyranny of planning, and we assume that if a person is thinking, they didn't have a good plan, when really, no, that can be where the human comes through. Like, that's actually where the human shows up, where the plan fails, per se, where the system fails is where the human, or is open. That's where the human shines. And if we associate that with an error, we should not be surprised then if the human is replaced or removed, because we basically said that the acts of which the human is unique in exercising are capacities that show you did something wrong. So the human then becomes an error. So let me throw it at you.
Yeah, discretionary power, the ability to decide upon a case and act, only happens when you get a weird case that you have to make a decision about. If every case is what you expect, then there's no reason to evaluate a case as what kind of situation is this, and then enter into it in some way. Related to also to what you were saying, humility as opposed to certainty. One of the reasons that humility is a virtue is because it keeps you engaged with the objects of your devotion. Without humility, you try to possess or take ownership of your objects of devotion. And when you try to possess them and grab them in that way, you strangle them to death and kill them. And it's the humility that makes you go, oh, wait, don't squeeze it. Just feel around a little bit.
Well, I think that's, well, humility too. So another thing that I like to claim, and thoughts are different things, is that one of the roles that religions could have is actually training people into menti-divergence, or also, I should also note that menti-divergence is the capacity for non-rationality, which I know I've talked about, on where non-rationality gets you through game theory problems. If you don't have menti-divergence, you don't have the capacities for non-rationality. So those things kind of go together. That all said, a key role that religions could have is actually making you do non-rational things so that you avoided rational impasses, right? So another major game theory problem we have is basically forgiveness. Like, we have a major problem now. Like, how do you get people to forgive one another? Because if you think about it, forgiveness is kind of irrational. Why would you forgive someone if they did something bad to you? And also, why would you want to continue relating to them? And shouldn't you also use the fact that they did something bad for you to get a kind of power? Or sort of, couldn't you use that for gains? Why would rationality ever have you forgive someone, right? Maybe if they're like you, or they're coworkers or family where you're stuck with them. But what about someone you don't have to be stuck with, or someone diverse or different or optional, whatever, right? Forgiveness I can see rationally surviving in terms of self-symmetry or maintaining your everyday routine. But forgiveness as this kind of radical acceptance of the other, love thy neighbor. When Jesus talks about loving your neighbor, most of the neighbor did not mean the guy in suburbia next to you. The neighbors were mostly a kind of other nations, and they all wanted to kill Israel. They were not friendly. When Jesus talks about the Good Samaritan, Jews and the Samaritans were not friends. That's basically the equivalent of Jesus talking about like the good atheist to fundamental Christians. He gives a story. So who is my neighbor? Well, let me tell you about the good atheist. Scandalous, right? But so the scandal of forgiveness, which seems to be incredibly important, especially for diverse functioning societies that want to avoid self-symmetry and all the problems that come with that. Well, that's a game theory problem. Because it's almost always advantageous not to forgive, right? So religions are like, well, you have, like they say you have to, right? It's part of the doctrine, right? It may not make sense to you. You may not like it, but you need to do it, right? Well, if you have that, then there are certain Nash equilibria situations that if you don't have forgiveness in this way, there are certain game theory problems that are eventually going to arise that you're screwed. You're not going to have a chance with it. Humility is another example. If you don't have, why would you ever be humble? Why? Why would you do it? You could argue rationally you should never be humble, right? Unless you have an understanding that I don't know things, I need to have a certain humility, this is greater to me. Rationality experiences itself as knowing everything. And if it knows it doesn't know something, then it actually knows it doesn't know something, so that's part of its symmetry, right? To actually believe there are things you don't know that you don't even know, and thus you need to hold things open to the possibility of a disclosure beyond what you even are expecting, that kind of humility or also a humility that would make you listen to people who you think are politically ignorant or stupid or even evil, like a certain holding back judgment, even when you're like, but I've seen evidence they support Trump. I've seen evidence they support, X, Y, and Z. They're clearly stupid. They've entertained, whatever. Humility says, yes, you have seen that, but pause before you assume what that means or that disqualifies them from public life. There's something about humility that I also associate with not disqualifying certain people from public life or interaction, right? Like you may think that it's the ability to say someone is wrong, but not cutting them off. There's something about humility there. The reason that, so for me, that's also a kind of problem because a game theory problem, as I keep saying, is because if you think someone is wrong, isn't it rational to cut them off? What if they infect you with their bad ideas? What if they, get into your family? There's a way in which if you truly believe someone is wrong, it seems to follow that you would cut them off, right? That you wouldn't interact with them, right? Well, if everyone does that, since everyone necessarily experiences people who think different from them to some degree being wrong, well, then you start having a whole lot of fragmentation and people don't talk and then they don't gain political capacities and then they don't train thinking and the ability to evaluate interactions and everything goes to a very problematic flatness that we can't escape from. So all of so that's another thing, I guess what I'm saying is, to me, when we talk about the idea of the death of God and et cetera, so forth, there's also an issue where the waning of religion institutionally, you could make an argument that, as Charles Taylor does, there's been a Nova effect, and actually religion in other ways has been exploding. But I think it is clearly less institutional in some sort of characteristics, and it more has a certain personal customization. The problem is personal customization always leaves wiggle room not to follow the things you don't like. And the things you don't like are often the non-rational teachings that if you don't do, you end up in game theory dynamics. Now, that was a lot that, I'd have to really expand on that. But I think actually a loss of the religion has contributed. And then the holdout was the humanities. And if you lose that as well, then you have no non-rational capacities or very little. And you are going to end up in these problematic outcomes in these various Nash equilibrium problems. So that's part of the problem we have. Please.
Right. This reminds me of the prodigal son and the pride of youth. The youth sees that there's no rationality to the practices and goes, ha ha, I've recognized that you're all stupid. I'm better than all of you now because I have rejected these practices. But of course, the prodigal son eventually, through a process of having to live life, will come to see eventually why it was that the community operated that way. And in some sense or other, maybe return in a way still committed to some sort of revision of what the community does, but a revision that would aim at furthering the capacities of the community to do what it does, as opposed to a one-sided rejection. And that comes from, there's humility, and people think that the complement to humility is pride, but pride is just a vice. There is no positive side to pride. There is, however, a positive side to courage.
Yes. Yes.
And the courage to act even though you're not entirely sure. That courage has to be separate and distinct from pride. And the real trick is to get humility and courage together, to not have humility make you a coward, and to not have courage make you proud. And that's a really difficult pair of things to get into one person.
I think so. And, not to jump, I know Lindbergh at the store and other people have been talking about, and this is true, the magnanimous. And the magnanimous is the love of great things, not you being great, but you love something greater than you, right? And there's an interesting mixture, there's an interesting humility in the magnanimous because you are going, that is greater than me, and I love it in its greaterness than me, actually. And that I also believe that there's something good in being in the presence of something greater than me, right? That there's actually something that comes from that can't be known. The variable that could be added is I do think there is a courage in coming to the magnanimous, right? Because it shows your flaws. It shows that you're lesser, right? And it takes a courage to see that and to face that, right? And to me, the magnanimous, this gets tied to how you've been talking about the good. Like, this is so important because the good is fundamentally a magnanimous relationship. Like, it is that of which you can't bring to your level. It is greater than you. You can orbit it, you can approach it, but never fully bring it into, conceptualization, or else it becomes it becomes a form versus the good per se. There's something about magnanimity, as I understand it, that is the posture of a subject toward the good as such, or we talk about the beautiful. As I really did enjoy the question of between you, Catrone, and sublation, talking about this. What is the best signifier for the open apophatic abstraction, right? Is it freedom? Is it good? What are the pluses and minuses? I think it's a very important conversation. I've sometimes thought about beauty, because beauty is this striking, it is this open apophatic abstraction that has this way. Now that can be captured by aesthetic pleasantry, but the idea is that we need some sort of relationship to an open apophatic abstraction. That seems to be, and we talked about it when you were here, that seems to be the only way to deal with the problem of the universal and the particular, the many and the one, the way to have some sort of harmony of bringing people together without necessarily squashing difference, all of those difficult problems that are practically consequential, funny enough, because if you can't deal with that, it really matters. There's something about the posture of magnanimity that I associate with the bringing of the courageous and the humble. But you see, magnanimity is seemingly the posture that is necessary, but how do you get people to be magnanimous? Like that's well, religion's like, well, believe in God, or it's like Plato's like, believe in the good. Like there needs to be a metaphysical concept where magnanimity even makes sense, right? Or else it could just be magnanimity before your great leader, right? But that, of course, is politically fraught, because it could be the magnanimity, which is actually just authority, is actually just getting sucked into an authoritarianism, right? So how do you have suppose a uncaptured magnanimity, per se, that is not in service of something? It seems to require some sort of, well, I'll say it again, open apophatic abstraction, that without which you can't have this positive form of magnanimity, and that leads to all sorts of problems. And I think then also we see courage, because there's a certain courage required to even meet the conditions of being able to experience the good, right? Like there's always classically like your capacity for experience is tied. Virtue is not merely you get check marks. It is your freaking capacities. And I should also note, in belonging again, we associate menti-divergence with virtue. The gaining of virtue is actually a gaining of capacities, not merely golden check marks by your name. Without that, you can't have the experience of the open apophatic abstraction, by which then magnanimity becomes a concept that really is not sense to us. So I don't think it's, well, honestly, I don't think it's by chance that concept as even a notion has been lost. We don't even know about that notion, right? But in losing that, I think we're losing sight of things we need. Please, Benjamin.
Yeah, which is why you can't virtue signal. You can only signal vice.
That's, yes.
A lot of ancient texts that think about virtues think about it in terms of ladders. Certain virtues as being prerequisites for others, and trying to put them in an order so that you can actually think about an education that would go in a direction toward a specific point. Of course, if you think in too linear a way about virtue acquisition, then you'll run into many of the problems with linear thinking that we discussed in relation to capitalism. So it becomes too neat if you just make a little ladder out of it, and then you start to go, okay, I have this one, so now I can go get that one. No. Virtues can't simply be had like that. If you start to think that you have them too much, then you start to lose them. So it can't simply be rungs on a ladder that you grab and move up, even though a ladder of virtues is often the metaphor. It's a misleading metaphor that can lead to mistakes. There is this constant need to go back to all of these others, which is why they work so well as signifiers that point to certain things, but of course seem also to be insufficient by themselves. If you thought you had courage so you never had to think about it again, eventually you would lose the courage.
No, absolutely. And it's in the point you were just making. I was speaking to Christian last night, and he was talking about, if in a conversation with someone you tell them this is beautiful, it tends to create conflict. No, it's not. This is beautiful. This, the isness. But if instead you say to someone, this gives me a sense of the beautiful, then it opens discussion, right? Where just the use of the word is tends to create conflict. We're talking about the sense of actually can change it. Well, when things were analogous, when they pointed to the good, it actually could be easier to have pluralistic or diversity, because whatever I said was good, we all knew wasn't the good. It was perhaps glimmers of it, right? And that ability
Yeah.
to see things as glimmers opens up pluralistic possibility. Please.
Yeah, an awareness of the insufficiency of any particular instantiation.
Yes.
Not merely. The apophatic is not just a no, it's a not merely.
Exactly. Exactly.
Not just that. That wouldn't be enough by itself.
No, absolutely. Well, it's the interesting issue where the apophatic has to be a known, not known, right? Or else it would not be the apophatic. It would just be not known, right? So there's actually, the word apophatic is always relational, but it's relational in a way that is always glimmers or veiled or missing, right? Like, it's also I like to think sometimes with Leibniz, the problem if two things are too similar, they're the same, and therefore not two, they're one, right? Well, likewise, if something is too different, well, then it's actually not different. You have no relationship with it at all. It doesn't, it's gone. It's not different. It's not there, right? So you have to always strike a certain middle ground, I guess, a weaving of similar and difference. Everything is a mixture of similarity and difference, because things are not the same. They're only similar, which means all similarity has a trace of the different, right? And that then is that's thinking. For Leibniz, that then is the grounds of thinking, is realizing that all similarity has a difference, and thinking the difference and thinking the similarity is the inevitable human involvement that makes intelligibility possible at all. Otherwise, there would just be a flat sameness, please.
Yeah, which is why no analogy is complete until you say what's insufficient about the analogy.
Yes.
You have to say not just how is this like that, but also how is it not like that. And until you do that, the analogy is a convenient device to avoid having to think about the difference.
Well, absolutely. And again, there's something. So on the question of what does the humanities do versus the engineer, there's something about where the humanities is thinking incomplete thoughts well, thinking thoughts that fail well, and actually making the failure part of the thought, like a engine of the thought. The failure is essential to the thinking. Actually, like you could say that more engineering thought is about getting rid of the failure points, because otherwise the machine won't work, the system won't work, right? But what if there are thoughts that the failure of the thought is actually what makes it itself, and without that failure, then it fails. The failure is why it succeeds, right? The fact that an analogy doesn't work is why it works. It's the problem of the map is the tariff. Like in computer science, there's the idea, is this weird thing where a model works because it's wrong. All models are wrong, but some are useful, as Bach famously says. So you have this problem of, if I have a map that is identical to the territory, it's useless because I can't open it. It's too big. It will crush me, like in the Borges story, right? The exactitude of science. A map is useful because it is wrong in a useful way. It cuts out technical detail in the right way so that I can use it to understand the territory. A map that is too precise is not useful to me. But of course, if it's not precise enough, then it also is not useful to me. So it goes with ideas. Every idea is not the phenomenon, but the key is that the idea is enough like the thing that it actually has a relation to it, but not so much like the thing that you couldn't think the thought. If literally every time you thought the word cat, you thought the entirety of what a cat is, you couldn't have a conversation. It is precisely because words are wrong, but wrong in a good way, wrong in a useful way, that thought is possible. So philosophy, if I were to say, much abstract reasoning is learning how to be proportionately wrong in a manner that the map is useful. Which, of course, then, funny enough, means you can't even do pragmatism with a map until you figure out how to be wrong well, right? So pragmatism comes after the making of the map, which requires the thinking of how to be wrong well, right? So if you never have that thought, what map are you using? Probably one map. Everyone will have the same map, and the biodiversity, quote unquote, of the motivational structures or thinking will be very flat, and therefore the system will be flat. It won't be very dynamic. And at that point, you may need a shock to the system in order to change it fundamentally, right? Of course, that risks unintended consequences and crises, but if you don't do it, you'll be stuck in the map. So there's always there's always the issue. What I think analogy, and then I'll give it to you. Analogy trains you when you say it trains you in this thinking between being able to understand and technical correctness. If it is entirely technically correct, you can't understand it, or it's useless. You're just going to have the phenomenon, right? So you have to find a proportion of right and wrong so that you can think. And that's what you're constantly doing. You are constantly in a conversation assessing, was the term I used right enough that the other person understood it, or was it too complicated that they didn't get it, or maybe it wasn't complicated enough. A conversation is a perpetual sort of assessment of, did I use the abstraction in a manner that felt that, I guess, bi-fitting in computer science. They talk about overfitting, underfitting, so I think it's bi-fitting. So is there a certain fittedness to that? And you're constantly assessing it, right? And basically, like, thinking has a certain, in that sense, thinking has a certain language to it always. And if we're kind of practice and data, we're not using language if you're just memorizing or reading the data. Therefore, you're not training that faculty of assessment constantly. And then if you're in a situation where you need to do that, well, you can't do that. And if that's a capacity necessary for the human, you lose it, right? So it's really important. Well, I guess the last thing I'd say is, and then I'll give it to you, is that if you metaphysically ascribe to there from the onset being, say, a god or a good, that which you can only point to, well, then that makes you toward reality seeing analogy or a failing thought as having value, right? You understand you need to fail well. So you're then culturally habituated to having some degree of space for that capacity. Maybe it's only in church, maybe you don't apply it anywhere else, but you have at least got some space for it. Therefore, the fundamental diversity of the social order and thinking is a little more complex. It's a little more dynamic, right? Well, if capital kicks that out, and you could say religious thought has, well, it would be an argument of the changes of, if I were to just make examples of Christian theology perhaps went in a bit of a anti-theology direction. It was just kind of simple Jesus getting down to earth. How do we just share the gospel and not worry about complicated theological matters? Or even, it would be another topic, and I'm not going to say I'm an expert on Karl Barth, but there's an emphasis in the church dogmatics on really, you can't say God is good. There's that classic debate. If I say God is good, is that idolatry? So, it'd be better to say that God is not good, because that's more apathetic. But Karl Barth basically comes along and says in the Church Dogmatics, Volume 3, that the analogy of being is the tool of the Antichrist or something like that. You could argue that Barth changes his view later on, but I do think there's been generally in American Christianity a deconstruction of analogy as a mode of thought in favor of, what does the text say, what does the word say, sola scriptura, and all of these different things. Now, of course, all sola scriptura is actually interpreted, and I would also argue that it's not so simple with Martin Luther. When you go back to Martin Luther himself, there's a different narrative, but now I'm in church history and I'll pull back. The point is, you had spaces of training analogy that if you don't have that space because capital have somehow creeped into it, well, we don't have the ability to think this thought, so all thought is basically engineering thinking. We lose the capacity. We're stuck in the game theory problem, and I guess just go buy your Starbucks latte and have a good time. I'm not quite sure, but Benjamin.
Yeah, this is also true for theories. As I was listening to you, I thought about a time that I was at University of Chicago, and I was in John Mearsheimer's American Grand Strategy class. And he said, a good theory is not always right. A good theory is right maybe 2/3 of the time. And along similar lines, I don't think you could really say, in terms of a percentage, how often a theory is right. But there's also, I think, coming out of what you're saying, this idea that a theory is also helpful and good, even when it's wrong.
Yes.
Indeed, sometimes it's more helpful when it's wrong than when it's right, in part because it then spurs you to see what is not quite right about the theory. What does the theory miss? What isn't emphasized by the theory? And so in simplifying, it allows for a more effective complication.
Yes, yes, yes.
And in this way, if you have a good theory, it helps you to generate a better one. Whereas a lot of bad theories, because they're too bent on being right and want to be right all of the time, will befuddle you and put you in a situation where you can't even see what their limits are or how you would think outside of them, and can get you mired in garbage.
I think that's exactly, I completely agree. Well, there's one thing that perhaps gives me a little bit of hope for, because I think you're right. This problem, you could say theory has also suffered, like theology and the loss of analogy, because we don't, like, I know he calls him a realist in thinking on that idea. And so that's very interesting. You took a class with him. I think on that idea, we are so programmed because an engineer, if we say that engineer only made one bridge that failed, we would go, oh, well, I'm never hiring him, right? Like the whole mindset of the engineer of pragmatism is basically they never make a mistake, right? If they make a mistake, the whole thing crashes. Or let's put it this way, a good engineer never makes a consequential mistake. They may, of course, maybe make the bridge a little less whatever, but a good engineer cannot make a mistake that causes the whole thing to come crashing down, or they'll be fired, right? So the idea of a significant mistake and as being acceptable is not even in our parameters. Like it's not a real field, basically, if there are consequential mistakes, right? Well, if theory must always have a opening for the possibility of a consequential mistake or something occurring that you didn't know could occur, or basically the theory is 80% right but 20% wrong, or different mixtures like that. You can't say a bridge, 80% of it stood, only 20% of it failed, right? There's this kind of idea that it's either all or nothing. Well, then basically you're habituated by associating real thinking with engineering to seeing the limits of theory as evidence that theory is not valid. That theory is actually just a waste of time. There's no good to it, actually, because you've been habituated into that association, which then means you don't have the mental apparatuses needed to bear on complexities so you have a better effective hold on those complexities, as you were saying. So then we can't think trade-offs. We can't think political capacities. We can't think magnanimous. We can't think analogy. And basically you're set in a certain mode of being or capacity that makes you completely habituated to the logic of capital toward the techno Cthulhu, as Mr. Downs has talked about, or not being able to escape the game theory problems that you are in. So I think that's very good. Please, Benjamin.
There's an old Latin proverb, "Bis peccare in bello non licet." To blunder twice is not allowed in war, but to blunder once,
Yeah.
that's allowed. Indeed, a lot of what happens that's interesting comes from what do you do when you blunder the first time? How do you handle the first blunder? And if you can't tolerate any blundering, then you're not really able to act in a lot of terrains where blundering goes with the territory.
Ooh. No, exactly right. If you're not allowed to, well, what ends up happening is if you're not allowed to blunder, you are never allowed to experience where the map isn't the territory, and thus you can never think a new map. You can only go back to the map you have. But the moment, like I sometimes talk about the Gödel point, Kirk Gödel, which is is precisely the point where you encounter the map isn't the territory. Because what, Gödel found is not that truth is impossible, but that you basically have to make trade-offs between coherence and correspondence. If you have a completely coherent mathematical system, that very coherence makes it to where you can't determine its correspondence. You can't make it axiomatic. And if it is axiomatic, then it doesn't correspond with anything and therefore is a useless set. So you have this problem, right? You have to make trade-offs between consistency and correspondence. Well, I would argue that's all thought. Like a thought that can correspond with reality would be hardly a thought. It would just be an impression of a phenomenon, right? It would, a thought that has a certain level of complexity necessarily does not correspond one for one with reality, only incompletely, like an analogy, right? That's how you're able to get a coherence by which you then have a map that you can use to operate in the territory, but that works by becoming less clear that it corresponds, right? Well, every time basically, that means you're always going to make a map and always going to have a thought that eventually encounters a limit. Okay? Well, if you expect that, then you're ready to think. Like you're habitually like, I know one day I'll have to think. I know I'm going to have to make a new map, right? But if you're not allowed to encounter the limit, what that incentivizes is you never go outside the map. You stay on the map and you never explore something beyond it and therefore get a more complicated map, right? You're stuck in the map. Tariffs are bad. Tariffs are good. That's what the map says, right? So it never encounters the limit. So what ends up happening is the map is the only capacity then you will ever have. And you better hope that map entails all of the capacities you ever need for all possible situations that the human can encounter, and it probably won't, right? So
And this is that, also the sense in which things seem to have slowed down, while at the same time, in other regards, they seem to have sped up.
yes.
People think that they have grasped in some way in this era that we're in a set of rules for how the economy must work or must operate that can be deployed in any situation. Much like the physiocrats in the 18th century who believed that only farmland, only agricultural wealth was real because you could feed people with what it produces. And if you were making tools, then the function of those tools was just to facilitate the creation of agricultural wealth. So if Britain makes tools and France produces food, this should make Britain completely dependent upon France. And actually, France should make all sorts of trade agreements on this basis because it's giving itself power over the food supply. Many people think this way about manufactured goods now,
Yes.
but it's not at all how it actually works. Because in point of fact, it's become much easier to produce enough food to be able to feed your population. And it's become much easier to produce enough tools to do the things that you really need to do. What people are making now is not tools that are strictly speaking necessary for food production or tools that are strictly speaking necessary for things that we narrowly need. They're making all sorts of other things in a desperate bid to get the attention of the American consumer, which is a totally different kind of world. But that totally different kind of world is not grasped by people who operate under a set of presumptions that come from a previous epoch.
No, I completely agree. And that goes back to the point you were saying earlier on production, and people are overfitting that model and they can't think it because they're stuck in that map and they've hit the girdle point. So they try, like when you face a girdle point, the choice is either think or go the other way. And you see, the problem is if you go the other way, the girdle point doesn't go away. It's still the limit of the map. So you end up having a certain bad faith behavior. And I think one could argue much economics has a certain bad faith to it, a certain Saudian, border where you're kind of too, like there's a certain bad faith in the sense of, and I don't want to over push this, and I'm not trying to mock the profession or different things, but there's a certain sort of, you say that your models are not the economy. You say that there are limits to quantitative reasoning. It just happens that the day never comes where you use that beyond quantitative reasoning or your models, right? And at that point,
the purpose of the humility is actually just to legitimate the models so that you can impose it more completely and more totally all of the time. The only function of the humility is to get room from other people to then be dogmatic.
That is 100%. I'm actually very glad you said that, because that's an example where the use of humility without non-rationality, the rational way to use it is actually to game as a kind of gamification to get more legitimacy for the totalitarianism of the system per se, right? Or for the model, right? So humility becomes a kind of trickery, if you will. Please.
This is something I was talking to Dave about recently with regard to Mott and Bailey arguments. So in a Mott and Bailey argument, you're accused of having taken a position that is hard to defend. And you go, no, I've been misunderstood. I didn't mean that. I was using that language in a much broader way to mean something else entirely. And Dave goes, isn't this a case in which the apophatic is used to get out of trouble so that you can't be challenged on the particular cataphatic instantiation of the view? And I said, yes, this is a case where means and ends have been swapped around. So instead of using the cataphatic as an operational case of the apophatic to get you to a position where you can come into greater understanding of the apophatic, you've swapped it around. You are using the apophatic as a tool, discursively and rhetorically, to defend the cataphatic position.
Yeah.
And that's what makes the Mott and Bailey insidious. It's because it trades upon some ability to think conceptually, but does not put this to its proper end, but to its inverse end.
1000%. And basically, to jump back into the theology debate for a second, one of my someone I love, who I found because of my beloved William Wilson at UVA, was a thinker named Austin Farah. He wrote a very interesting book called Defining the Infinite, but he was basically arguing that he was trying to think Aquinas and Karl Barth, who I mentioned. Karl Barth is basically like, no, analogy is evil. we need to kind of honor the apophatic difference of God. And Austin Farrer basically kind of suggests, well, first off, the moment you're using words, you're using analogy, because words are not definitions. They're all analogous in Hofstadter and Sander and Surfaces and Essence. Kipsky basically makes these points. And so there is no such thing as non-analogous reasoning. All reasoning is already analogous, but he also just makes the point. He's like, but you see, if there is an analogy, then the apophatic becomes a defense of the capacitic. That's exactly what occurs. If there is, because you basically, we can't think God, so therefore whatever is, right? It becomes an ultimate solidification of whatever is the case, because you can't think beyond it, and any effort to think beyond it is heresy or something like that. And so that's a really severe problem that emerges. And I think basically if you don't have this certain sort of analogous, participatory, orbiting understanding of the apophatic, then it basically becomes a way of keep out, stay back, accept what is the case. And then it seems like you're honoring possibility, but actually you're closed off to possibility, because you're basically saying what is what is in different things. Well, the way also I think about it is, Michelle has this lovely example of a bird, and she talks about if you saw a man clutching a bird by the feet, would you say that man owned the bird? You'd be like, no, he kind of possesses the bird, right? Someone who owns the bird or who has a relationship with the bird is the hand is open and the bird can fly off and come back. You would say, oh, that person is a bird. That one really has the bird. The other person doesn't have the bird, is trying to escape. So likewise, when you talk about the apophatic, it has to be something that can come and go. If you just saw a guy without a bird at all, you'd be like, well, he's a guy. He doesn't have a bird or anything, right? But if you saw someone clutching the bird, you would be like, that's not healthy. Likewise, someone telling you everything that God said, and it's a kind of possessive. But the apophatic is only effective if it's this coming and going. If there's this, it goes and it comes and it goes and it comes, which means you always have to be ready, and you always have to have basically every possible capacity, because you don't know under what conditions it might be there and what it might not. And it creates a certain humility, because you can't just snap your finger and make the bird come, right? It comes and goes on its own times. It's outside of your control. But you have to have the analogy kind of thinking, if you just use that as a phrase, in order for the apophatic to not have that function that you were describing, right? It has to have that sort of thing. Please.
Yeah, and part of what helps you to get it is to be okay with not getting it.
Yes.
Which is why, for instance, Buddhists who are obsessed with becoming enlightened can't actually do it.
Oh, no. Well, that ability to think not having it as having it almost. I guess Thomas Wynne talking about Heidegger, the later Heidegger has languages like letting or annihilating, which is this interesting sort of like a posture of letting, right? Where it's not that you're indifferent, but you hold yourself in a manner where the thing can come upon you from a certain clearing, right? Like it's a
right. And if you're in the framework of I need to be or I need to have, I, this is not the kind of thing that comes to someone who is thinking in that mode.
Correct.
So that mode is self-defeating, but it's one that many people get caught in for incredibly long periods of time in many cases.
Yes. No, I completely agree. And to me, so there's this issue of thinking that productivity is all we need, and like that actually it's more than productivity. We've alluded to actually narrative. Like it's not like America is able to create this incredibly powerful consumer base tied to something like narrative, or getting them to want to consume, or getting them to see value, the libidinal, right? Which automatically you're dealing with, if that's true, you're dealing with variables that are not easily quantifiable. They're not reducible to a simple utility calculus, which, funny enough, then means that the very conditions of possibility for emphasizing pragmatism, the wealth that affords that, requires that, which is not in pragmatism, of course, which is always fun, right? But there's this idea that there's some sort of thing that motivates people, right? And if we were speaking very, very generally, you could argue that economics as a field, especially when we see an Adam Smith writing, he's not just writing The Wealth of Nations, he's doing jurisprudence, obviously, the moral theory. Like, there's a question of motivation. Like, what motivates people, like sentiments. He's having all these conversations with David Hume. And there's this problem of motivation, right? Which gets into where economics is obsessed with incentives. How do we motivate people to do something, right? You could say a dream of various thinkers could be, well, if we make them think it's rational, that will motivate them, right? Maybe not. People don't necessarily do something because they think it's rational. It depends, right? Or they think it is the ethical. Then they will do it, right? Well, it depends on what you mean by that. You get into all these details, right? So the point is, there's this problem of motivation that is at the heart of, dare I say, the human condition, right? And how do you motivate people? Well, it makes sense that in earlier forms of economics, there could be a stress on food, for example, because if people are hungry, they are motivated to get food. If they do not have water, then they are motivated to get water. But what motivates people once they have these things? Well, maybe envy and greed and, status, right? Because now they're motivated because they hate driving a 1990s Oldsmobile while their neighbor has a 2025 supercar or something, right? So then they're motivated. So you're creating motivations that are starting to arise. And please, Benjamin.
And also the promise of the pleasant experience that you haven't had yet.
Yes.
You haven't gotten to a point where you realize that all pleasant experiences are a little bit fungible. They're all kind of the same after a while.
Yes.
If you don't recognize that, then you'll imagine that some pleasant experience that you see through media other people are having that you haven't yet had would radically improve or transform your life.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please.
One of the things my dad used to tell me is that the way to overcome temptation is to indulge until it becomes mundane.
Yes.
So you realize that actually there's nothing there.
Oh, no, that's really funny. Not to jump in. I know Cadell has mentioned playing video, having a problem with video games or just playing video games like crazy till they become boring. And I know Alex Ebert talks about saturation as phase transition. You saturate something until there's a certain transition out of wanting to do it. I think that's brilliant. And it's interesting how that can change motivation. Please.
Yeah. And so people will think, okay, I've gotten bored of this thing, so I have to go find something else pleasant to do. But if you can really, really penetrate to the heart of this, what you'll recognize is that doing pleasant things in general is repetitive and boring. And finding a new video game, finding a new thing, it doesn't actually create any new, greater promise. All these things really do is perhaps allow you to recharge a little bit. If you're tired and you're low on energy, there's some possibility of one of these kinds of hobby activities giving you a recharge. And so if you think about it in those terms, just, I need a recharge, I'm tired. Then when you find yourself playing a video game, you can also ask yourself, why is it that I have to play a video game right now? Instead of trying to organize your life so that you can play video games as much as possible because you think that will be your good, and to play new video games all the time and more advanced video games all the time will, you think, give you something special. You would come to recognize that when you're playing video games, it's a symptom of you having recently lived in such a way that you had so little energy that all you could get yourself to do was play video games. And then you get to interrogate, why am I doing that? And am I doing it within a parameter that is compatible with the habitus that allows me to do the things that are actually important? Or am I doing it way too much because something is not right in my life that is thereby leading me to a chronic energy problem that leaves me constantly engaging in activities that are about trying to get energy back or to regenerate it?
No, that's brilliantly put, and I'm glad you brought up boredom, because that's critical. There's a lovely literary scholar, Patricia Sachs, and she wrote a book on boredom, and it's in the literary history of the concept of boredom, and she makes a fascinating argument to suggest that we do not see boredom as a concept until basically Pascal, 18th to industrial. Like, boredom is very modern, is the argument. And you say, well, that's ridiculous. What are you talking about? She's like, no, no, no. You had scole, you had leisure, you had nothing to do, but boredom is this certain existential dread or this feeling. But critically, boredom is not where you have nothing to do. It's where you see no significance in what you could do or no motivation in the possibilities presented to you. So boredom is very different. And of course, what's very interesting is boredom is tied to prosperity. The more prosperous the society, the higher probability that there is boredom. And again, boredom is so interesting because doesn't it sound kind of nice to sit in your chair and not have anything to do? Isn't that kind of cool? And yet there's an experience of it that becomes existential, right? But that's something about the subject. not the phenomenon themselves, right? And basically the argument, to say something very broad, the problem that modern economics have, or like prosperous societies, is actually the problem of boredom. And the reason why supply does not necessarily stimulate demand is boredom, actually. And boredom is precisely a result of supply. Supply generates boredom that destroys the efficiency of the demand. So then you have to fight. So the economy, this kind of, in my opinion, is why we have to break down why it is rationality and the motivation of people in capitalism, because it's the idea that, okay, in markets, people are going to be motivated what increases their lot, right? Therefore, they don't have running water, so they'll invent a way to get running water. Water's hard to get. The problems motivate solutions, and the whole idea is that people will, the people's self-interest will then lead people to innovation and so on and so forth. Well, what if you have a problem of boredom that a lot of people's self-interest is directed to overcoming? You're now taking them away from problem solving, innovation, creating wealth, to actually dealing with a certain existential wound that won't necessarily create wealth for other people. Because again, the idea of capitalism is non-zero sumness, that everybody wins. All ships rise together. It's supposed to not be zero sum, right? And you could argue that capitalism, in my opinion, is a complicated picture because you have periods of non-zero sumness followed by zero sumness, and it depends on how much wealth creation is in the system. There's all these kind of mixtures, right? But the vision of capitalism, the dream, is that it is more non-zero sum than zero sum. Everybody wins versus not. And a lot of that follows from an idea that people are self-interested in improving their lot, and the way they improve their lot is in a system that must benefit other people, and therefore all is well, right? Well, the probability that that is the case is perhaps higher when people are motivated by non-existential problems, mainly boredom. If they are primarily motivated by boredom, then the directionality of people's demands will be very different than when they are motivated by figuring out how to get clean water or how to get air conditioning, right? Well, capitalism comes along and we can deal with that boredom, pleasure, buying cheap good, all of the things of post-1950s capitalism is basically dealing with boredom. And another way you deal with boredom is getting you in status games, or promising you or giving you power at the top of a corporate ladder, or you replace boredom with the, getting more money and in the promise of a future experience and fulfillment, which of course gets into all Lacan psychoanalysis, the object, the stuff Mikey talks about. What's very interesting is so much, in my opinion, of the psychoanalytical playing the role that it now does in modern capitalism is tied to the treatment of boredom. And you're dealing with boredom, which is the opposite, you could say, of libido. Like boredom is when you don't have libido. You've lost that energy, that sexual drive, all these different things. Although libido is not simply sexual, it's more of this life energy. It's more complicated, right? Boredom is when you find yourself not producing that, not generating that. And so then something that gives it to you is what you go toward. But then here's my overall point, and I'll give it to you. Market efficiency toward dealing with boredom is very different than market efficiency dealing with a problem of not having running water. Very different. And the question is, do you want market? And let's also this is also the point. I think the problem of boredom arises in the lack of capacity, ergo the lack of virtue, ergo the lack of thinking, right? Like once you gain, there's something about these capacities which are more intrinsic and internal to yourself, like you're actually making yourself this place of thoughts that are alive and unfolding. You train yourself out of boredom because you just find it, like once you read or get into philosophy, you just find yourself thinking, right? You find yourself in these modes, like your being has a certain vitality to it that is just there. Like you get to the point where you forget what boredom is. You don't even know what boredom is. Actually, you wish you did have nothing because there's too many books to read or something, right? There's this certain sort of wheel within a wheel that sets in that changes you as a consumer. Here's the key point. It changes your market behavior, right? And things that are simply catering to giving you a way to escape boredom are no longer appealing, right? So the other issue is we haven't seen, basically, this is my point. Basically, the issue is we are in an age where capitalism that is not simply catering to a lack of running water. It has not been mobilized to deal with a subject who isn't bored per se. And now, unfortunately, one of the ways it did that was say, well, I'll make sure you're not bored. I'll just take your time energy. Then you won't be bored. You won't be existential. I'll just make it to where you're exhausted and therefore you're not bored. So that's another way you can actually deal with the problem of boredom. Which, of course, I'm not trying to simplify everything to boredom, but it is an example of
Yeah.
where so much. Please, Benjamin.
This is why there's got to be enough time for people to still consume.
Yes.
And that's the limit, but the consumption has to be in this bad energy time. So
Yes.
you'll have energy, but not the right kind of energy, just
Correct.
enough to consume. That bad energy time is absolutely pivotal to make the whole thing work. And as I was listening to you, I was thinking about a book by Haruki Murakami called Pinball 1973 that he
Mm.
wrote in 1980. And in that book, his main character is trying to find a pinball machine that's identical to the one that he played on as a kid so that he can recapture in some way the the energy of playing the pinball game, even though he understands intellectually that pinball is a waste of time and that all pinball does is take your time and energy away from you in a meaningless way. He understands this on some level. Nevertheless, because he played it as a kid, he has this association with it, and he becomes absorbed with trying to get the pinball machine back. And he just needs to play it just very briefly to remind himself that there is no intrinsic meaningfulness to the pinball machine. At the end of the story, when he gets the machine, he plays it very briefly, and then he's good. He's done. He's encountered it. He's had the experience, and then it's over with. And as you were also talking about this, people used to get to a point where they wouldn't be so interested in many of these kinds of things. You couldn't get a middle-aged man to consume the way that you would get a child to consume, or even for a long time, as marketing executives would have told you in the 50s, his wife. His wife would consume much more than he would generally, so much so that the advertising would tend to cater to his wife. It took an enormous amount of work to produce a middle-aged man who still wants to consume like a child. This was something capitalism required and needed, and it took an enormous amount of social engineering, marketing, degenerating of conditions to produce a middle-aged man who would not have the midlife crisis, who would not recognize the emptiness in that kind of consumption, or even in the various palliatives and alternatives to that consumption, which still have something like a consumptive quality. That was incredibly difficult to do, and yet we're there. We now have middle-aged men who don't properly have the miserable middle-aged man experience. And it's my favorite genre of contemporary art, literature, film, the miserable middle-aged man who realizes that the choices that he made on the basis of what he thought were meaningful have just led him into a cul-de-sac of meaninglessness. And yet the only way for him then to get out of the cul-de-sac of meaninglessness is to do something irrational that destroys his life, and which will cause all sorts of problems, not just for him, but for anybody that is around him. And then, of course, there's the terrible, terrible dilemma if he has children of what to do about that. Because if he hasn't been able to find meaningfulness in the having of children, now he has not just a crisis of meaning that is on the basis of having discovered a meaninglessness to that which was meaningless. He also has a crisis of meaning that comes from his having failed to discover what was meaningful about what he did in fact manage to get along the way. So he's liable to, in a one-sided way, reject the whole life instead of reconfiguring it in such a way that the parts that are meaningful can come out and seem to be meaningful. He's so cut off from the source of meaning that he can't even recognize the parts which have that potentiality. And so ultimately, he often destroys the whole thing in a way that is throwing the baby out with the bathwater, burning down the house.
Which then makes you go, he should have just learned to appreciate being a consumer, of course, right? Like if all that ends up happening is everything gets destroyed, why couldn't he have been happy as the adolescent middleman? So it has a kind of ideological function.
Yeah, so there's that, but then there's also the possibility that he could have found a more moderate, temperate way of reconfiguring the life, which would have overcome certain parts, but not these other parts. And then there's also the possibility that it was structurally overdetermined in such a way that there was nothing he ultimately could have done. His situation was too much of a straitjacket. And then his attempt to get out of it is sad because it comes from his knowledge of it causes him to try to escape it in a way which can only cause him pain. Birdman is like that.
Yes.
Unexpected virtue of ignorance. Once he becomes aware of the limited quality of the life that he made, this only makes him unhappy. He's not ultimately able to get out of it. And so there are all of these different ways in which the middle-aged man who encounters the situation can try in various ways to contend with it. And whether they work or don't work depends on the specificity of the particular situation. So for me, there's a great aliveness to this genre because you can have a middle-aged man have this realization in an enormous diversity of contexts and situations, some of which give him real options, some of which give him fake options, and some of which give him no options at all. And to watch a person navigate this has been incredibly educational for me in my own life. This kind of film has helped me avoid doing so many things in life that seem like they are good options or that they're proper off-ramps or that they could possibly lead somewhere. So I so often find myself having to explain to people why I don't do things. Why won't I do this? Why don't I do that? Well, if I did that, where would it go? Even if it worked, it would eventually lead me into a middle-aged man movie.
Oh my gosh, I have done that. I've literally, it's like that will lead like to that middle-age crisis. That is exactly right. Well, it's very funny because, but also that's to there's something about the zeitgeist that's not able to accept inaction. They associate inaction with never doing anything when really it's like, no, I just want to, when I make a choice, it really be a good choice. And it just turns out that often your life is better to make less choices, but to make choices when you should, like at the key moment, right? And there can also be an understanding of that would lead to that, that would lead to that. And that's actually really important. You could argue a capacity is actually the ability to identify the choice that should be made versus never make choice or always make choice or the thing that should be done, being aware of that. But I think speaking about art, well, that's an example of a value of art because it's a certain training of moral imagination, per se, I guess is how Hannah More put it with Karen Pryor's book, right? And there's, I think, a lot of imagination. I probably will have to do dinner with the kids in about 20 minutes. I don't know where the time went. It's a complete joy, but probably about 20 minutes. I've really enjoyed this. I really don't know.
I figured dinner would be our limiting factor.
Yeah, the dinner.
Even at the start, I thought eating.
It's gonna be
that's
dinner.
What will eventually
Eating is apparently
stop.
matters. It reminds you of your humility. It brings you back to earth. But there's a few things. First, a key idea that you put forth is the making of the middle-aged man, right? Markets are made. And according to a certain imagination, it's a certain creative act, isn't it? This is what's funny. Like you create the parameters in which you say only pragmatism works according to social imagination, right? And you could, I guess you could go to Cole Planier on this, but I also always enjoyed, again, how Hannah, how Dr. Pryor ended her book on Hannah More, who was a great abolitionist and so on and so forth, where basically she said, it is imagination more than ideas that make the world. Because imagination is your realm of possibilities, and ideas are set according to your... Imagination is the horizon upon which ideas unfold. And if you don't have much of a horizon, your ideas can only unfold in a very narrow way, right? The broader your imagination, the more your ideas have, directions to go in. There's more dynamicism, we might say. Well, if markets are made, if they're imagined, then that means they can be imagined in new ways, right? New possibilities are there. The question is only if we have the capacity to imagine. And you see, what ends up happening is often imagination can occur in the clearings, the Heideggerian clearings. Well, another clearing can be, a quote-unquote tariffs, crisis, tearing it, making you go, what in the world is going on? Well, I guess it doesn't fit into your box of what you're used to, so maybe you have to think outside of the box, right? And these sort of spaces where things go differently can be invitations to imagine, right? And it can actually kind of make you see again that possibility. Now, there is the thing where you open up that clearing and you don't have the capacity for it, so it's just the Lacanian real that overwhelms you. I like to talk about Lovecraft with craft in parentheses, love being Dante, Lovecraft being Lovecraft, and these moments of the opening where you see possibility can reduce you to ash before like an ancient one, or it can be the beatific vision that actually makes you want to participate and changes your motivation and desires in different things. But the key idea is that imagination has something to do, and what we imagine, or the kind of people imagination or creativity lead to what motivates, leads to how we think about motivation. And if so much of economics is a question of motivation, and I think also when you take politics in the way you do and ultimately bringing it to, well, the good, right? Or thinking the good, or the these these impasses that you have, where then what can bind people if you take those seriously? Well, that's going to change people's amount of motivation. If you can imagine the good, if you can imagine that humans are actually meant to participate in the good, and you imagine that as you get older, it is not about keeping you an adolescent who's playing video games. Maturity is tied to your capacity for the good. Markets would be very different. Incentives would be very different. The way people are motivated would be very different. And there'd also be a belief that the experience of the good is in of itself motivating. I think that's a kind of key idea, is that once you experience the good, well, then actually that changes what you want to do. That changes your desire to play video games till 2 in the morning. Once you've tasted it, once you've experienced, once you've had the strike of beauty, as I talk about with jogging, it changes you as a consumer. And it changes you. It's almost like, sometimes the way I think about it, and then I'll give it to you for any thoughts, is that instead of productivity, we need to think creativity, creating demand. We need to think imagination. And instead of being consumers, what the good opens you is to being a participating in, part of, right? And it makes you wanting to participate, not simply ingest, right? You want to have within you what is necessary so that you participate, but reality is not what you put in your stomach. Like the idea of calling human beings consumers, perhaps we're not minds on a stick, but then I guess we're just bellies on a stick. All we are is a belly anymore that's consuming. And there's a certain radical reductionism in that. And how do we become producers, like participators, right? Which, please note, is different from a producer, because you don't produce the good. You may be able to produce things that enables your ability to participate in the good. You may be able to produce things that help with that, but you can never, ever, 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 ever produce the good, right? You can never do it. And all you can ultimately do is participate in it. This is my point. This would transform motivation. And in my opinion, ultimately, when you start talking about new political orders, new economic possibility, you're talking about changes in motivation. And obviously, time energy is a change in motivational possibility, right? Because you have the time energy to thus to be afforded different modes of motivation, right? So if you want to change the system, change the world, or however grand we want to put this, there is something that is being said about changing what motivates people and how they are motivated. And for me, that is going to end up in analogy. I guess the other thing I wanted to say is you were making the very important point of association. People associate the pinball machine with childhood, and people are driven by associations. I think there's an argument to be made that without analogous reasoning, you have no control over associations. Like analogy then gives you a certain standard to direct your associations. You're almost just kind of caught on the tossing waves of your associations to be taken wherever they lead, like a bird. How did Faulkner say? Like the bird dragged toward infinity on an invisible wire, carrying its frustration on. Like there's a way in which association is that invisible wire in The Sound and the Fury, just pulling us on like Benji or something like that. Analogy takes association and points it up. Like without analogy, association keeps you, I guess, flat. And there's a way in which what you're doing with analogy is you're having your associations like, yes, this is the movement of thought. This is the adding of a certain thought to a material condition that is actually looking for a way to be pointed, to participate in something beyond itself. But without analogy, then association cannot be so directed toward the good, and then it just gets captured by the system. The system just captures your associations to market to you. You associate this with when times were good, therefore you will buy the product. So your own associations are gamified against you to make you a good consumer, right? Well, once you start thinking about analogy or participation, well, then you're directing association to be sublated into that. But if you don't do that, then you're in really, really big trouble. And you can't generate different motivations, which will change how you participate. And then, like, if that ultimately has to occur, and then I'll give it to you, some sort of transformation like that, or else the only thing that will motivate us is that which is toward the techno Cthulhu or Cthulhu, I can never say this, or being a mouse in the Kafka story, or a motivation stuck in the neurotypical, therefore in game theory problems, then you require a fundamental shift and something that even opens us thinking the fundamental. And it could be even so. Let's say tariffs are just the stupidest policy ever, and there's no redeeming quality of it. If it actually opened up that thought, you could argue it's necessary. Even if you could make the argument that there is no, never, ever, ever economic benefit, if it opened up the possibility of thinking these thoughts, then it could be a good thing to do, simply because otherwise we won't think these thoughts and just end up as a techno Cthulhu. So, that's all. But let me give it to you.
Yeah, as I was listening to you, I was thinking about Les Miserables and Jean Valjean, who steals from the church, but then is nonetheless protected by the church.
Yeah.
And the effect of that moment upon him and on his character is very profound, because he has been treated well, he has experienced the good, and in experiencing the good, he then becomes driven in some way to find alignment with it. But of course, nevertheless, the assumption is that he can never change, and that he must necessarily always be the bad kind of person that he was at the start. The trouble with a lot of these kinds of experiences is that there is no set of institutions or systems in our society that ensures people have them. And so they happen very contingently. Whenever you hear somebody talk, oftentimes they bring in people to talk to kids, and they'll go, I was on the wrong track. And then a contingent set of events that nobody could have predicted happened. And then as a result of those, I became a better person. And you should just be a better person without any of the experiences which I then had, because they're horrible and you shouldn't have to have them. And yes, they're horrible and you shouldn't have to have them. But if you don't have some kind of experience that elevates you, and all you get is someone didactically telling you, don't make the mistakes I made, in some sort of pragmatic way, because if you make them, what? You won't be a success, you won't make a bunch of money, your parents won't be proud of you, whatever. That's not going to get the job done. And we don't have institutions or structures which reliably give people the kinds of experiences that elevate them. And the people who make policy are not live to that as a reason or as a purpose for which they would structure an institution. They're instead thinking about, how do we produce enough software engineers? How do we produce enough STEM graduates? How do we get people who can pass the various tests and go to the schools and slot into the labor market? And that makes it very difficult to generate at scale large amounts of alternative kinds of energy. But nonetheless, we might, through social organizing, produce at smaller scales certain bits and bobs of capacity in various places within the social structure. And while that might not give us a whole society that could be characterized as motivated by a different kind of energy, it might give us something to work with, something on the basis of which we could then make thoughtful interventions if we study the situation that we're in and work at trying to understand it.
Beautifully said. I completely agree. And for me, what we are doing and what Theory Underground, what I have called the social coordination mechanism is basically the infrastructure of the possibility of people being motivated by different incentives and in more dynamic ways, by the good, by things other than the narratives of capital. And you see, if we accept a Heikian pricing coordination, then you could say pricing in the market is very good at coordinating resources, et cetera, so forth, and that's great. The issue is that it assumes a motivation, or it assumes a metaphysic, if you will. There is not a mechanism for diversity or complexification of motivations or things that you're using the pricing mechanism to coordinate, right? Well, that would require a infrastructure by which to do that training, right? By which to bring people together to have those certain experiences, right? And ultimately, it's going to look like Platonic dialogues are bringing people together because there's a certain orbiting of the good, a certain circling, right, that's going on, right? For me, this technology, Zoom, YouTube, what we're saying online, is a social coordination mechanism that basically affords the possibility of there being more menti-divergence in the system, even if it's only 3%. The more, if we accept what we have been saying, the less menti-divergence in the system, the more inevitable a game theory problem that is very severe. If there are percents of menti-divergence in the system, then the likelihood of not ending up in a rational impasse next equilibrium is higher. Also, the more menti-divergence in the system, the more other people, you can have network effects, people can have those experiences. It can complexify the social dynamics, of which are the condition of the social imagination that can think of different consumers, different inventions, different mediums, different ways of doing things, of which then can start to complexify the ecosystem of the fundamental motivations upon which the pricing mechanism is set. And then the pricing mechanism, almost like a judo move, which here's another one. It then actually is helping effectively coordinate the different subjectivities beyond the logic of capital that then actually sublate it into being a mechanism that is in favor of these capacities, as opposed to coordinating that of which trains us out of these capacities. Because it's kind of like Catrone would say, like, there's this idea of, do you deal with the problems of capitalism by directly opposing it? Or do you use its energy within it against itself, right? Like, if you destroy capitalism, you can't do judo to it. Which, as Neil Postman says in The Soft Revolution, the spirit of judo is using the strength against it, right? So the question becomes, how do you use the strength of capital against the logic of capital, per se, so that it can have a certain sublation? Well, please.
Yeah, capitalism is this pragmatic thing that needs other kinds of energies to be able to subsist. It generates such an abundance that it no longer could pragmatism possibly be the principal energy that would drive it. We would have, if you only made decisions based on pragmatic needs, the amount of consumption that you would do would be a fraction of what it is, and the system would not ultimately be successful. What this means is that pragmatism in general, capitalism creates this still seeming sense that it's important, but in actual fact, it is less and less important. Pragmatism seems like it's the only way to think and reason, but in actual fact, it's becoming more and more possible to be non-pragmatic, and therefore not just erotic or centered around Time, but potentially other kinds of non-pragmatic energies also become more compatible with survival as the actual amount of stuff that you really need becomes a smaller and smaller percentage of the total consumption that takes place. I think that's where there's a real possibility there, because in the Middle Ages, if you didn't perform your economic role, there was a very real possibility of not having enough food. That's why the physiocrats could think that all wealth came from the farmland. And it's why they could imagine that the farmland would give them that kind of power over the English with their silly tools. But for precisely that reason, there is ultimately an eclipsing, and yet that eclipsing does eventually give rise to non-pragmatic possibility if we are able to take that up.
Very well said. Well, if one says, to use the wonderful example from Murakami, and it makes me think of the white Dance, 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 Weinberg, Kafka on the show. Murakami is quite lovely. If one says, capitalism is keeping me from getting the pinball machine, therefore I'm going to tear down capitalism to get the pinball machine or to get the status, you're actually not opposing the logic that makes the system possible, right? The revolution is actually a circle, just going back to where you started, right? So the question becomes, if you can't overturn the system in the name of getting the things that the system denies you that you want because of the habituation of the system. And I think often that can be, you have to introduce, like you said so well, new energies, right? There has to be new energies, new motivations. And if there are not new motivations, then you cannot have a revolution of capitalism. You could tear it down and maybe go to something worse, or you could tear it down and still have the training of capitalism, which means you just bring back the logic of capital under a different administration or something, right? Right? But then the problem is people think that the choice is between accepting the status quo or changing something and breaking everything, which this entire tariff debate has brought out. That's how people think. But what we are talking about is imaginative possibilities that are due by practically creating infrastructures that changes people's motivations, that then in openings where people are thinking possibilities, they then have the capacity to actually do something different in that. And if we're not thinking that, then I'll give it to you, then we can have all the debates we want all day about tariffs, and you're simply moving around pieces within the frame that assumes the logic of capital, which is the grammar itself that is the problem, that if you don't introduce new different kinds of energy, then whether tariffs are good or bad will ultimately be beside the point. Please.
Yeah, if it's possible to create other kinds of habits, if capitalism produces enough of an abundance that within the margins of it, we can create other kinds of habits that produce other kinds of subjects that want different things and who have political capacities, they're able to organize together and work together to achieve those aims, then even insofar as capitalism will still generate an enormous amount of consumptive tendency, it can also generate other tendencies which may inadvertently over time contradict it.
Yes.
And this is, if you think about how we got out of feudalism, it wasn't because the kings were bent on making the towns as big and as rich and as powerful as possible. It was that it was an inadvertent consequence of the things that the kings were going for that these towns formed and became what they became. The kings, in trying to create peaceful conditions under which people could move around freely, in trying to secure their legitimacy so that they wouldn't have internal conflict, civil war, and protect their realms from invasion, protect themselves from being killed, in trying to get their nobles and to get their priests under control, and therefore to bring those nobles and priests into an urban center where they could be watched and observed. The things that the kings were doing, principally to strengthen themselves and keep themselves safe, inadvertently built up this other way of living.
Yes.
And then that other way of living grew to a point at which it could potentially be something. And that's what ultimately capitalism has to do. It has to produce another way of living by accident, which nonetheless over time can become large enough and significant enough to provide a base for an alternative.
That is so well put. That is exactly right. And for me, the social coordination mechanism is that infrastructure that it is created inadvertently that actually is the possibility of the judo move. Like the revolution has to be judo per se. Like any revolution that is not judo is not actually going to work because it will not be a, well, increase in freedom, good, however you want to put it. And so you have to use the energy that is there on itself or quote unquote against itself to create a certain contradiction that in the Hegelian sense gives you a sublation, which is a new that includes the old. I forgot, that German word, right? So that's why for me, the identification of, okay, what is it that you would change that would use, because I strongly associate capital, like if I were to say, what is capitalism, which, is very simple, I would say fundamentally, I think Hayek talking about the pricing mechanism is pretty close at it. It's this mechanism of coordinating resources as a collective consciousness, and you're trying to figure out the most effective way to do it, et cetera, so forth. I'm not saying it's just that, but if we were to say what is at the beating heart of it, the pricing mechanism is a pretty good bet. Okay, how do we use the pricing mechanism to make effective the coordination of different energies and modes of consciousness to generate habits that generate political and philosophical capacity so that we can be motivated by the good? Because that would be a lovely judo move. Okay, we change people's motivations because ultimately the pricing mechanism is tied to motivation. Like if people want something, then prices, and there's a limited amount of it, prices go up. So then everyone says, prices are going up in Virginia. Let's send our Barbie dolls over there because we'll make a lot of money. They send a lot, prices come down. So people's demand, the demand helps via pricing, helps people determine where resources go. Okay? So it's all tied to motivation. Well, if people are motivated for something else, or they're motivated by the good, there then is the pricing system goes, okay, we'll send it over there. Coordinate and help the resources go in that direction, which then is changing how people are motivated out of the consuming of the cheap goods to being participators in the good that would actually then have the housing and the assets and products fall in line with that meaning, as opposed to a nostalgic dopamine rush of having the same ice cream you used to have when you were 7 that you love. Ergo banana ice cream. I have a weakness for banana ice cream because I had it when I was 6, and it reminds me of that Hillcats baseball game. But anyway.
That's a great point, Daniel. Speaking about food, are we about at the
I know, I
point
do.
you have
I
to
don't know
go
where the time went. I've really enjoyed. Yeah, I'm looking at the clock. I'm like, I guess I should do that. This has been delightful. Thank you, Benjamin Studebaker, for your time. I very much enjoyed the conversation, and I don't know where the time goes. And to me, everyone, if you're wondering what tariffs and are tariffs good or bad, remember, it doesn't matter unless we do judo. So at the end of the day, may tariffs remind you of the importance of judo. Sign up at your local YMCA today, increase social capital, and help bring back community where we can imagine a new way of being human. Thank you so much. Benjamin Studebaker, thank you so much. I've enjoyed every minute of it. It's been a treat.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.
It absolutely has. And the Agaraja is always open for you. And as you know, the porch is as well. Thank you, Benjamin. I've really enjoyed it. Best to you, sir.
Definitely.
Have a good one. All the best.